Good morning, everyone. As President of the Royal Irish Academy, I would like to welcome you all here today to the Centenary Conference on the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty debates, which is the third joint conference held between the Royal Irish Academy and the Houses of the Oireachtas. In February 2018, we collaborated to commemorate the passing of the 1918 Representation of the People Act, which gave the right to vote at national level to some women. Later that year, we held a conference in Dáil, the first 100 years, 1919-2019, and that reflected on the establishment of our national parliament and on its evolution. In both events, participants included journalists, politicians, and scholars, and we continue with that lively debate today. For each event, we have brought together leading scholars from the island of Ireland and from Britain to reflect on the important and challenging issues that characterize these events. Today, we turn our attention to the treaty debates, the gripping episode in Irish history in which relations between Britain and independent Ireland crystallized to the document of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And these were vigorously debated. On the 6th of December, 1921, Articles of Agreement were signed in London after nearly 2 months of very difficult negotiations. The treaty secured a significant measure of self-government, but not a republic. And Article 4 also included an oath to the Crown by means of the Constitution of the Free State. So Ireland would share a king with Britain, but would be otherwise effectively independent. However, this compromise was regarded as a bitter betrayal by some of the Republican ideals of the 1916 Rising leaders, and the movement up to that point was disappointed. Notwithstanding the truly slight references to partition during the debates, this was a critically important background factor of vital interest to people on both sides of the border and in different ways, and indeed to Academy members. And we will be hearing some important reflections on the position of the 6 counties in the following sessions today. Referred to in the debates as the peace treaty, delegates were deeply divided over what had been achieved. The Irish Independent on the 7th of December suggested that this historic document, if ratified by both parliaments, would leave the Irish Free State, quote, mistress in her own house and in a position to work out her own salvation in peace and without hindrance, unquote. In the first session, we reflect on the immediate history before the treaty debates began to examine what the pertinent issues were, what figures dominated the scene, and how we got to the point of a truce and a treaty with the British administration. In the second session, the treaty debates themselves are analysed. You will hear reflections on the mood, atmosphere, location, and language used. Many of the speeches are well known, but some of the issues raised are still being discussed, researched, and debated by scholars. The last session today is dedicated to the aftermath of the treaty, a period which unfortunately saw strife and bitter conflict mark the birth of our independence. The violence of the War of Independence shifted in form and continued across the country. The Civil War was fought over the treaty and its potential, or in some eyes, lack of potential. And as you all know, it divided the country as well as individual families. Aside from the proclamation of the Irish Republic in 1916, no document has had a greater bearing on 20th century Irish history than the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. We had very much hoped to have this event in person and to welcome you all to Academy House to do so. We will have to defer such in-person meetings due to the ongoing vagaries of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we hope you will participate through posing questions in the chat to our panelists, which our chairs will manage today. I would like to thank all the chairs and panelists for their participation today. I am very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. This conference was sponsored by the Historical Studies and Ethical, Legal, Political and Philosophical Committees of the Academy. And the organising committee consisted of Ewan O'Halpin, John Coakley, Daithí O'Corrán and Jennifer Redmond. In particular, I would like to thank Jennifer Redmond for her superb organisation of today's conference. She has been at the centre of all three conferences in this series, and each of them has seen the benefits of her expertise, breadth of knowledge, and imaginative approach. I would also like to thank the Academy team of Vanessa Carswell and Eric Hughes. I would like also to acknowledge the ongoing relationship between the Academy and the houses of the Oireachtas. We have had pleasure working with them on this series of events, and we continue to be grateful for their support. Thanks are due to Derek Dagenham and his team, and as well, of course, to the Ceann Comhairle and Las Ceann Comhairle. The Ceann Comhairle Sean Fhuala is unable to join us today, as you know, but he has sent us a message which we will hear now, and it remains to me to wish you a fruitful and interesting day. Thank you very much.
I'm pleased to address a few short words of welcome to you all as you begin your deliberations and academic survey of the treaty debates 1 century on. It is a genuine pity that we cannot meet in person in the ornate lecture room of the Royal Irish Academy, as we find it increasingly difficult to see light at the end of the COVID tunnel. We have learnt the new normal of communicating through the mists of the high-tech ether. I wish this online conference every success and look forward to happier, healthier days ahead when these dark clouds have dissipated. Since taking office in 2016, I have been honoured to be involved in the commemoration of key events in our decade of commemorations. From the GPO to the fields of Flanders, through to the commemorations to mark the War of Independence, many events have been curtailed or adapted because of COVID-19. We now reach the treaty debates. As a non-historian, conscious of addressing so many distinguished specialists in this area, this period strikes me as a pause, a forced pause, perhaps, in the hostilities of a guerrilla war inconclusively concluded and before the bloody, angry outbreak of civil war. The political pause of these few short weeks in December 1921 allowed for a final civil engagement and analysis of the current situation in Ireland as it teetered on the brink of final, damaging conflict. In the houses of the Oireachtas, we have produced an informative booklet to mark the centenary of the treaty debates, to which I was pleased to provide an introduction. In those opening remarks, I stated that as I reread the public debates of December 1921 and January 1922, what struck me most was the quality of the contributions. It's no surprise that emotions ran high in that cauldron of nascent Irish self-determination. The nation's public representatives were called upon to continue a debate which was, for many, a matter of life and death. Impassioned argument is to be seen in almost all contributions. As chair of Dáil Éireann, I think it appropriate to give special mention to the staff of 100 years ago, who recorded, preserved and protected the official record of those debates. Those were unusual times, but we have a solid historical record from which all further research could emerge. I am proud of the work of our current editor of debates and her team here in Leinster House, who continue to record, preserve and protect the public record of those speaking in Dáil Éireann, Seanad Éireann and the committees. The quality of the work undertaken by them greatly assists the work and research of historians such as yourselves. Seminars such as this one today serve to refresh our knowledge of this crucial staging post in Ireland's journey to nationhood a century ago. Many of the key contributors to the treaty debates were friends who were to become bitter foes. Some great names contributing were to die a few short months later. I hope contemporary reappraisals and discussions such as this will rekindle an interest in the actual debates themselves, which really do deserve to be read in their entirety. We have yet to reach the difficult years of the Civil War in our decade of centenaries, which will challenge us all 100 years on. The treaty debates give an ominous foretaste of the hatred which was to come and which was to blight our nation for so many decades. Again, I regret we cannot meet in person to discuss this seminal moment in our history. My thanks to my friends in the Royal Irish Academy for the invitation, and I wish you every success in your fruitful discussions and deliberations today. Guramagav.
Thanks to the Chancellor and also to Professor Mary Canning for the introduction. I am Jennifer Redmond and I appreciate the kind words very much for my involvement in this latest conference, which I'm very happy to be involved in. My thanks especially to Vanessa Carswell and Eric Hughes, who are managing all of the tech that makes this event possible. Again, unfortunately not in person, but I've just seen a message in the chat that says how much it's appreciated that this has an online component, because it means members of the diaspora can be involved in it. And that's very important to me as a migration historian, that we consider that too. I'm Vice Chair of the Historical Studies Committee, and I was very pleased to have the opportunity to propose to the Academy that we hold this event. I'm very pleased also to collaborate again with the houses of the Oireachtas. I'm very glad that the Ceann mentioned the importance of the debates and recording the debates themselves, because while we know that the revolutionary generation were rejecting pretty much everything to do with British rule, they didn't throw out formal procedures for recording parliamentary discussions. And for that, I'm very grateful, because now we can go back and revisit them. I wanted to remind you that you can use the Q&A function to pose questions to our panelists, and please do that. And the chat function can be used to kind of talk amongst yourselves. It's a virtual recreation of how you might have turned to your neighbour during the talk and said, oh, what do you think about that? Unfortunately, we haven't found a way to virtually give you the experience of handing you a cup of coffee. So please just wait for the technology to advance a little bit more. That's all that's left for me to say, other than my sincere thanks to the chairs and to the panelists. I'm very glad to hand over now to Dr. Marnie Hay of Dublin City University, who will chair our first session.
Thank you, Jennifer. You're all very welcome to this opening session of the conference today. And this session is going to focus on the period before the treaty. And again, just to remind people, if you do have any questions throughout the session, please pop them into the Q&A function as we go along, and we'll get to that later in the session. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce our three eminently qualified speakers to discuss this topic today. And so I'm going to introduce them each, and then we'll get on with the discussion. So our first speaker today will be Dr. Mary McDiarmid. She's a research fellow in the School of History and Geography at my own institution, Dublin City University. She's the author of the book Art O'Brien and Irish Nationalism in London, 1900 to 1925. 1965. So it's great. She'll be able to give us a London perspective, what was going on in the London Irish community at this time. And her book is published by Four Courts Press in 2020. And she's also published articles in the journals Irish Economic and Social History and Irish Studies in International Affairs. And our next panelist today is Professor Michael Laffan. He's Emeritus Professor in the School of History at University College Dublin, where he taught for over 3 decades before his retirement in 2010. He has published widely on modern Irish history, including books on the partition of Ireland, the Sinn Fein party in the period 1916 to 23, and of course, most recently, Judging W.T. Cosgrave, which was published by the Royal Irish Academy in 2014. And our next panelist is Professor Alvin Jackson, who is Sir Richard Lodge Professor of History at the University of Edinburgh. He specialises in the field of modern Irish and British political history, with a particular focus on the history of unions and unionism in the UK and of course beyond. He's the author of 7 books, including what I understand to be the most recent one, a dual biography, Judging Redmond and Carson, which was published by the Royal Irish Academy in 2018. So again, hello to all of our panelists and to our audience today. So to get things started this morning, and this is an open question to all 3 of our speakers, and can you tell us what your main approach has been to researching the period before the treaty? So maybe we'll start with Mary, please.
Well, my research approach has been to use the likes of Art O'Brien, who would eventually become the Sinn Fein envoy in London in 1919, as a prism through which to examine the contours of Irish nationalism in London between 1900 and 1925. And this obviously then takes in the pre-treaty and treaty and post-treaty period. And this involves looking at the cultural, political and militant aspects of life of Irish nationalists in London.
Thank you, Mary. And so we'll turn to you, Michael. What's been your approach to this period?
Well, I've had several. I've kept coming back to the treaty and the pre-treaty period. First of all, long ago, I was working on the Sinn Fein party, and I was looking at the relations between the civil and the military side in Ireland. Then I moved on and looked at, first of all came partition, and I was looking at Ulster, then the Sinn Fein party, finally W.T. Cosgrave, who wasn't himself involved in the treaty discussions or negotiations, but played an absolutely crucial role afterwards. So the treaty and its background have been part of my life for very, very, very many years.
Thanks, Michael. And we'll turn to you, Alvin.
Thanks, Marnie. Well, I've done a lot of work over the years on the partition question and the politics of the North more generally, and as you said in your kind introduction, on Irish unionism more generally. And I've been interested in the ways in which Irish unionism developed from a set of all Ireland perspectives towards the kind of partitionism, which is such an important backdrop to the treaty discussions and debates. And I think as well that I've had a secondary interest in the unions of the United Kingdom, primarily the Irish Union, but also over the past while and since being based in Edinburgh on the Scottish Union and even recently to some extent on the Welsh Union. And that's brought me back actually to the career of Lloyd George, that emphatic villain of, from the Irish perspective, of the treaty period, and just trying to get a sense of his peculiarly complex personal and political journey.
And I think that kind of leads us into our next question when in your reference there to Lloyd George. And this is open to all of the speakers. What key events or characters stand out as important to emphasize in our understanding of this period? So obviously Lloyd George is one of them.
Well, Lloyd George, of course, as Alvin says, and the Irish in a way were exceptionally unlucky in having Lloyd George as their opponent. They felt that they would get a better deal from him than from Bonar Law. I don't think they were right, because Bonar Law was concerned only with Ulster, and he was prepared to give the South effectively what it wanted. In the event, the Irish didn't get anything they wanted in regards to Ulster, so they might have got a better deal from Bonner law. But Lloyd George was a most formidable and skillful negotiator. And it's significant that when De Valera was about to go to London to meet him, he sought advice from Lord Middleton, the leader of the Southern Irish Unionists, who said, "Mr. De Valera, you are going to negotiate with Mr. Lloyd George. You must be a very brave man." And other observers of Lloyd George at the Paris Peace Conference, such as John Maynard Keynes, the economist, and Harold Nicolson, regarded him with awe and veneration as a man of quite exceptional skill. So the Irish were facing a very tough opponent.
What about you? Oh, sorry, Alvin.
No, Mary.
No, go ahead, Alvin.
I agree with that very substantially. Lloyd George is, of course, absolutely formidable, but there's a complexity there that's worth noting as well. I also think maybe that there's been a kind of a theme throughout the debates and the Civil War period, and subsequently, that somehow the Irish team in London between October and December 1921 were facing infinitely heavier guns. And we can maybe come back to that point later in our conversation. And certainly part of this kind of interpretation involves the formidable nature of Lloyd George. And he is, of course, formidable. He is formidable, but he's also interesting, I think, from an Irish perspective in terms of his political and intellectual journey. Like most of the Irish delegates, plenipotentiaries in London, he has a very modest upbringing. So he isn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, as with many of the Tory high command at the time. So there is some sense of a shared set of backgrounds. He's also, of course, coming from a Celtic patriotic perspective. Welsh patriotism, Welsh nationalism in his early career is a big building block or component of his political makeup. And he has a journey in his life, and that journey is not just from Crickheath in North Wales, to Number 10 Downing Street. It's also from a perspective of a radical Celtic nationalism towards an embrace of empire. And I have a sense that Lloyd George is effectively seeking to evangelize with Sinn Fein on behalf of a similar trajectory. A movement, towards an embrace of empire, something that he has done himself in terms of his movement in the 1890s away from the politics, the patriotic politics of young Wales, Cymru Fydd, through to opposition to the British campaign in the South African War, towards an incrementally more imperialistic set of perspectives.
Thank you for that. And is there any other characters that we'd like to highlight at this early stage of our discussion? We will certainly get into De Valera and his role in things, his controversial role in things later.
Arthur Griffith, naturally, as the leader of the Irish delegation, played a vital role, and in a way, a paradoxical one, in that he had been the great critic of the Home Rule Party because of its acquiescence on partition. Ultimately, he had to acquiesce in partition. Some people said he sold the pass. And eventually, he was about the only person on the Irish side who got what he wanted. He had always wanted a dual monarchy, two separate states sharing a king. That is what the treaty resulted in. Two separate states with King George V and his successors, heads of state of both countries. So in that way, if not in other ways, he could feel a satisfied man.
And I think too that we need to remember that the narrative tends to be the treaty negotiations and then the treaty. And certainly what my research in London showed me, that there was a lot going on for a year. It sometimes sounds as if the delegates landed at the treaty in October and that there was no thought went into anything beforehand. And I think there are a lot of characters, a lot of advisors, a lot of people that were around, that it wasn't just, as I said, as a complete start in October 1921. That there was quite a bit went on for up to a year and a half beforehand. And the whole idea of the underground oil and how people had to struggle to create a sense of government and then move into negotiations.
No, oh, sorry.
Just to follow on, I very much, agree that Griffith got essentially that which he wanted, given his origins as a dual monarchist with the resurrection of Hungary in his early career. And I think for me, Michael's point underlines, for me at any rate, the sense in which, that there is an ability with the negotiators which I think has been overlooked and is easy to overlook given the divisions which occur subsequently. Griffith does get broadly what he wants. De Valera knows in sending him to London what he's likely to end up signing off upon. So there's no great surprise there. And it's also the fact, I think, more generally, that Griffith, as with the other negotiators, has been brought up in the very hard school of Knox, that is separatist politics at the beginning of the 20th century. So these are not tyros, these are not novices. Griffith is an exceedingly experienced politician in a relatively difficult set of political environments.
And as we kind of noted, I mean, Griffith is somebody who actually gets what he had wanted, but lots of others, they wanted the Republic. They didn't get their Republic. But what did an Irish Republic mean? I mean, given the underground nature of Dáil Éireann during the War of Independence, you couldn't really have any, open debate about such things. So, really, what did an Irish Republic mean, and what was De Valera's position?
Well, I think from the Irish point of view, there wasn't any serious discussion about civic republicanism, the responsibilities, the duties of citizens, and so on. The Republic was an image of an Ireland totally different from Britain, much closer to the United States and to France, two inspirations for Irish nationalism. So they wanted to get a republic because it was not British, because it was clearly demarcated from the British. And the matters weren't discussed. There was no serious debate at all about different options. For example, one Dáil deputy, Alec McCabe, complained in a Dáil debate that there was a need for discussion about what Dominion status actually meant. That never happened. It was just taken for granted we would like a republic, but of course, with the exception of people like Mary McSweeney, very few people like her, people knew we are not going to get a republic, and they never looked at it. They knew it wasn't on. The British simply couldn't give it.
And I think living in London, it was even easier than it was in Ireland to latch onto terms like republic and self-determination and give very little thought to what this might mean. And I suspect this would have been a feature of diaspora nationalism, and in fact most diaspora nationalisms, that essentially the campaign in London or in Britain was to give support to whatever those living in Ireland decided was suitable. And this became quite clear then after the treaty, when the vast majority of the Irish in Britain accepted it and moved on. They were told it was a settlement by their politicians, by their newspapers, and a settlement was a settlement as far as they were concerned.
I think that I think that 1916 is one of the obvious key definitions of what the Republic constitutes. So that's kind of the heroism and the virtue associated with the proclamation and Easter week, and I think that's a central part of what the Republic means for many in 1919, 1921. I think the other point that I would make, maybe pulling away from that slightly, is that Sinn Fein is, of course, a coalition. It's a coalition united by a reformed constitution in 1917 and bringing together all sorts of separatists with very different views across the spectrum of national politics. And to that extent, I think, once the decision points begin to come onto the horizon, then the difficulties start to occur, because a broadly based coalition fighting a very clear enemy, the British, that coalition, once once the truce happens, now has to decide in detail what they're prepared to accept as a definition of independence. And all of the kind of the earlier divisions which had been brought together in 1917 under the leadership of De Valera and within the one still slightly ambiguous constitution, this begins to come apart.
And in many ways, I think it was inevitable, in light of that, because it was such a coalition. And maybe that, I think, brings us to De Valera's role in all of this. And it was something that's been, quite controversial, was his decision not to participate in the negotiations proper. And also that whole issue of plenipotentiary status. Did these make sense? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, De Valera was the only...
Dev, and then in relation to plenipotentiary status.
He was the only one of the Irish side to have met Lloyd George. And Lloyd George wasn't impressed by him, regarded him as a maladroit negotiator. And De Valera must have realised what lay ahead. So I think his explanations for not going are somewhat implausible. He knew that if he went, he would be blamed for not getting a republic or blamed for negotiations breaking down. The same, of course, applied in the case of Collins and Griffith. So he stayed behind and gave them those rather ambiguous instructions. The Dáil gave very clear instructions. These are plenipotentiaries. The cabinet went behind the back of the Dáil and said the plenipotentiaries must refer any agreement back. Now, the rump cabinet left in Dublin didn't have a veto right, but the agreement, the instructions from the cabinet was refer any agreement back. So there was a clash there. And of course, as we know, at the end of the day, the delegates decided to exercise what they regarded as their prime right and responsibility given to them by the Dáil and act as plenipotentiaries with consequences.
Yeah, I suppose just again, looking maybe from the London perspective, I would look at De Valera's meetings with Lloyd George as worthy, I suppose, of maybe more analysis, in the sense that I wonder what was it that made him decide, having met Lloyd George in London in July, that he wasn't going back for more. And I take Mike's point, that maybe Lloyd George wasn't impressed with De Valera and vice versa. But I think it is interesting that he, of all of the people who eventually were involved in he wasn't in the delegation, but everybody who was still, we'd say, in the Sinn Fein government in later 1921, that De Valera is the only one who had met Lloyd George at close quarters. And I just think that there is an argument there to say, well, maybe he saw something that made him realise he wasn't the best person for the job. But I think also there is the whole issue of control. And if you look at the Dáil debates in August and September, where De Valera is trying to bring both the more militant Republican side along with the, we'll say, less militant side, I think that his argument, which he made in later life, that he felt a need to keep control of things in Dublin, is valid. And yes, there are loads of reasons why you can argue he should have been in London. But again, I think just that there are certain arguments to be made on the other side as well. In an ideal world, he probably would have been in both places, but
I think that the Lloyd George conversations with De Valera are, as Mary says, critical. De Valera has a sense of Lloyd George from these conversations in July 1921. Equally important, perhaps more important, he also has a sense of what the British are going to give and what they're not going to give. So he, more than anybody else, at a preliminary stage of the dialogue between the British government and the Sinn Fein leadership, has a sense of what the ultimate deal is likely to look at. And it seems to me that he deliberately stays away from becoming embroiled in those negotiations. And various biographers before now, Ronan Fanning, Tim Pat Coogan in the 1990s, have, I think, laid emphasis, in my view, correctly upon upon De Valera's skills in terms of survival and his skills as a technician of political maneuvering and of political power. And it seems to me that Collins understood that to some extent they were being pushed out into the front line as potential scapegoats for a difficult settlement, and that De Valera was seeking to distance himself from the mess that was likely to occur in the aftermath of all this. Following Mary's suggestion, the only modification of this thesis, which I broadly think is right, is that there is a shift, if I remember correctly, in De Valera's title in the course of the summer of 1921. So he shifts from being president of the Dáil executive through to being president of the Irish Republic. This in August 1921. So he shifts away from a kind of political role to being head of state. And therefore, his status, as I see it in terms of his early negotiations with Lloyd George, and his status later in the summer of 1921, at least in his own mind, has shifted. And that may play a part. FSL Lyons years ago talked about Lloyd George as head of state, not wanting to kind of come down from that kind of moral high ground, into the hurly-burly of the political marketplace in terms of the treaty. And there may be something of that there. And I suppose one other aspect of all of this is that if there is a single key guardian of the 1916 Rising, well, to some extent that is Eamon de Valera at this time, and the vision of the 1916 Republic, I suppose he very much wants to personify.
Maybe we could shift gears a little bit right now. And Alvin, could you maybe talk about the extent to which the issue of partition, things that had already been in many ways maybe decided before the negotiations, to what extent was the issue of partition already settled before they came to London?
I think that the Sinn Fein delegates, plenipotentiaries in London have an enormous difficulty in this respect, and it's much, much greater than any previous leader of Irish nationalism has. So, I've looked over the years at John Redmond's fraught and difficult negotiations with Unionists in 1912, 1914, and again in 1916 on the issue of partition. But partition in 1912, 1914, and in 1916 was, to some extent, theoretical. It was a non-realized concept that the Unionists in the north of Ireland were moving towards and embracing with ever greater enthusiasm and indeed ferocity. In October, December 1921, partition is a reality. The Government of Ireland Act, legislated in December 1921, is on the UK statute books. The Northern Ireland Parliament and Executive are up and running from May, June 1921. There's been a pause, admittedly, in terms of the transfer of power, but in November 1921, in the midst of the negotiations, when Lloyd George feels that the negotiations may well fail, he begins to sign off on more transfers of power towards the north. And all of this is about the consolidation of a partition settlement, which somehow the plenipotentiaries have to negotiate away. A much, much tougher challenge than that facing the previous generation of Irish nationalist leader, whether in 1916 with the Lloyd George negotiations or before the First World War.
Mary talked a few minutes ago about the preparations in Ireland, in Dublin in particular, for the negotiations for a settlement. But there is one enormous gap, and that is partition. When the delegates went to London in October, they didn't know what their policy was. And poor Griffith had to negotiate with Lloyd George for 2 or 3 days, trying to play for time, trying to avoid any serious discussion until De Valera finally got around to telling him what the Irish stand was. That is quite exceptional incompetence. And it also illustrates the fact that partition was not top of the agenda. for the Irish leaders. What mattered most was the degree of sovereignty that the 26 counties, or 28 counties, whatever area would become a free state, or at least break away from the United Kingdom, the degree of sovereignty that that unit would have. That was their priority. They didn't in that way represent Irish nationalists, who are much more concerned about partition than they were about sovereignty. So the leaders were out of touch with the bulk of their followers. But they mismanaged partition from the very beginning by not having a policy.
Yeah, and I think that's why the Boundary Commission was accepted so readily. It was an answer nearly to prayer at that stage, because they were trying to control so much, and it was just really easy to move this enormous problem to somewhere else and to try and focus on what they were trying to do, even though that they didn't see the obvious contradictions in that, I think, at that time.
I have a quotation just to throw in maybe at the end of this section of our conversation from Sean McEntee. Sean McEntee, Belfast separatist who votes against the treaty, but essentially only because of the partition issue. I'm looking back from the 1930s, McEntee, who is, as I say, a northern nationalist, and one of the very, very few within the Dáil who pushes the issue of partition to any great extent. Looking back on Republican politics from the 1930s, McEntee said, "In regard to partition, we have never had a considered policy. It has always been a matter of hasty improvisation. It has always been a matter of hasty improvisation." I think that's very telling.
Absolutely. And I think maybe just more generally, some of these things happening on the hop. What about the whole grueling nature of the London negotiations? There were various subcommittees, there was the travel to Dublin, all the fears of espionage, and also the negotiating with such established British statesmen. Could maybe Mary, could you tell me more about what was going on there in London?
Well, in July, first of all, when Valera came to London, he arrived with George Plunkett, Robert Barton, Austin Stack, Erskine Childers and Arthur Griffith. And they set up their headquarters in the Grosvenor Hotel in Victoria. And they also were very ably assisted by Lily O'Brien, who was a member of Cumann na mBan, and Kathleen O'Connell, who had travelled with De Valera in the United States. Now, both these women were very experienced in the work of Dáil Éireann, and they were regarded as highly competent and trustworthy. And they assisted Art O'Brien and Erskine Childers, who set up press conferences on a daily basis, because there was huge interest from the press in London. And then when the Irish delegation came back in October, there were huge crowds to welcome them at Euston Station, and a pipe band to lead them to their residences. They were rented two rather elegant houses, one in Cadogan Gardens, where Michael Collins and his henchmen stayed. But Hans Place then was really the main centre of the delegation. But in addition to the delegates, there was a team of about 20 officials to provide support. And there were 5 women who travelled with the team as well: Kathleen McKenna, Alice Lyons, her sister Ellie Lyons, Gertrude Conroy and Lily O'Brien. And they spent long hours typing and taking shorthand notes and preparing documents for the delegates, for the cabinets in Dublin, and for the various economic, fiscal and defence advisors who were in London. And they also dealt with constant press inquiries. And many years later, Kathleen McKenna wrote that they were under considerable pressure, and that it was very hard to keep up with the constant changes in drafts and reports. And she talked of days full of alarm, full of hopes and fears, rumours and counter-rumours. And she said they packed their bags virtually every second day to come back to Dublin, that the talks were going to collapse. And I think rather sadly at the end of the negotiation, first of all, she said at the end of negotiations, as you can imagine, that they knew every word, comma, phrase and clause of the treaty. But she also talks about tidying up and their sense of a job well done, and then their dismay when they came to Dublin. And I think more than anything, it captures, and I think this is one of the things what I mean about preparation. It may not have been the best preparation, it may not have been the best use of, we'll say, negotiating skills or whatever, but these people put their hearts and souls into this and really worked so diligently. As I said, not just during the negotiations, but for many months before. She talked also, Kathleen McKenna, about gathering stuff in Dublin. What should Griffith bring to London? What should the delegation bring to London? And as it's just to maybe not lose sight of the great efforts that were put in.
And I think you've given us an insight into an angle on the treaty negotiations that we wouldn't normally see. And I'd like to turn to Alvin here, because I think you have another angle that you can explore here. Where were the Southern Unionists in the politics of the treaty?
Southern Unionism before the War of Independence era is, for better or for worse, one of the major players in terms of the British-Irish relationship. So the Southern Unionists, who number about 250,000, 250,000, that's the number that's generally suggested, maybe a little bit more, but around that kind of figure. They are disproportionately property, they're disproportionately privileged, therefore, and in an era when property bestows extra political muscle, the Southern Unionists exercise that muscle in terms of the overall British-Irish relationship. But I think that the history of Southern Unionism in the pre-1920 period is one of incremental decline, not least through the land purchase revolution that has been taking place from the 1880s onwards and culminates in the Land Acts of 1903, 1909. This is the transfer of landed property from the old ascendancy interest to the farmer classes. So Southern Unionism essentially is in very, very rapid retreat. Southern Unionism after 1919 is also institutionally divided. There is a split within the movement between the kind of battalion commanded by Lord Middleton called the Anti-Partition League and the old Rump Irish Unionist Alliance, the Anti-Partition League being more pragmatic than the Rump IUA. And the consequence, I think, of this long-term retreat plus the divisions of 1919 and afterwards means that Southern Unionism, that in the very recent past, would have been exercising a real influence, is now much, much more marginal, both to British considerations as well as to Irish. Some of the key representatives of Southern Unionism within British high politics have now stepped back, people like Walter Long or Lord Lansdowne. And as I say, the kind of influence that had been exercised, in fact, so negatively as recently as 1916 in terms of the Lloyd George negotiations by Southern Unionist leaders, that influence is basically rapidly fading. So they're there at the sidelines of the negotiation. I think the conversation between De Valera and Lord Middleton at the Mansion House in the summer of 1921 has already been mentioned. They're there as kind of low-grade facilitators. But at the end of the day, in December 1921, with the treaty that's signed, their interests and their specific case are, in fact, not really very well represented at all. So from having played a major role as, in essentially subverting earlier attempts at British-Irish dialogue, and the 1916 Lloyd George negotiations come to mind, they are now reduced to, in effect, powerlessness.
And maybe we'll shift back, looking more centrally at the negotiations. And I've got a question here for you, Michael. Your work would suggest that some Irish politicians and soldiers were unable to understand or even countenance that the British had interests to defend in those negotiations. Maybe could you say a little more about that?
Well, during the negotiations, Collins remarked sort of casually that it's not up to us, it's not our job to understand what British politics are about. Of course it was his job to understand what British politics was about. All the delegates should have been looking out and seeing what was happening in Britain. You know, there was a feeling at the time and ever since on the part of many people in Ireland that the British were behaving in a totally unreasonable fashion, that the Irish had voted for independence, they should be given it. The British were one of the two dominant powers in the world. They were never more powerful. They had won the greatest war in their history. Their empire was larger than ever before. So to take them on was a formidable achievement. Why should they give everything that a group of their traditional enemies wanted? Why hand over? They hadn't been defeated. Okay, they hadn't won the war, but they hadn't lost the war. And the idea that the Irish should be given what they wanted, give them a republic. No, the British could not grant a republic. It would be a massive loss of face. It would be a sign to the rest of the empire that London could not be relied upon to defend what it regarded as its own interests. So Lloyd George was as passionately committed to a monarchy, and so were the Conservative Party, passionately committed to a monarchy as many Irish, like Cottle, Blue, Austin, Stack, were committed to a republic. There was ideology involved on both sides, and the Irish didn't really appreciate that the British were going to dig their heels into such an extent, or at least the delegates did, of course, by the end, because on a daily basis they encountered the British and they realized that some Irish back home didn't appreciate that the British were going to dig their heels in and were not going to give way on crucial points, and it was unreasonable to expect that they would. They hadn't been totally defeated.
Mm. I think at this stage, even to consider, and this is open to any of our panelists, how important were, though, that international context in terms of the wider context in, say, the empire and beyond, in terms of the negotiation and the framing of the treaty? How important was that international context?
Well, just initially to say that in the first instance, the Home Office in London was compiling reports on what they called revolutionary activity in Britain during that period. And they were very concerned that you had Egyptian nationalists, Indian nationalists, Scottish nationalists, Burmese nationalists. They were all talking to Art O'Brien in London and very impressed with the work of the Irish Self-Determination League, which was set up at De Valera's request by O'Brien. So in their reports, you can see that they're not just concerned about Ireland, they are very concerned about the impact right across the empire and about a merging of forces, which didn't really happen, but which was of, and especially Indian nationalism, I think, in London at the time.
But the First World War had changed everything. It had introduced concepts like the rights of small nations, for example, that the Irish were to latch onto and did latch onto most effectively. And there's one rather strange aspect of the international situation. It's often said that it was only in 1950, when India became a republic, that the idea of a republic within the empire was conceivable at all. But until 3 years before the treaty, there had been a role model that nobody could think of or mention, and that was the defeated German Empire, which consisted of various kingdoms and duchies, but also two republics, Hamburg and Bremen. And they had fitted in perfectly happily to an empire for a long time. But Germany was defeated, the empire was gone, and that pattern, insofar as it might have had any influence, didn't exist anymore.
I think that the British certainly look at Ireland in 1919, 1921 very, very closely in terms of the South African precedent and analogy, and what they are partly and I think consciously trying to achieve with Ireland is what they believe that they have achieved in terms of South Africa, that is to bring former military enemies, the South African Boers fighting the British Army in 1899, 1902 into a settlement within the Empire or Commonwealth framework. So in the South African case, the Union of South Africa of 1909, 1910. In the Irish case, the Irish Free State, and indeed, of course, the very kind of notion of a free state is acceptable within imperial discourse because it has a precursor, a precedent in terms of the Orange Free State within South Africa. So South Africa, I think, is one important parameter so far as the British are concerned. Canada is also invoked periodically. So when Dominion status is being proposed, it's Dominion status in the mode of Canada. And I think the reason for this is that a previous generation of Irish nationalists had talked about Canada, certainly John Redmond had talked about Canada as a potential analogy for how Ireland would evolve in terms of an imperial framework. The very fact that Redmond had probably deployed this kind of comparison or exemplar didn't help it in terms of the politics of 1921. But Canada is still there, and I think it's Erskine Childers who makes the point that, well, the British are offering us Canada, and that's all well and good, but Canada is 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, and therefore Dominion status is practically a much different concept than it would be as applied to us a few miles across the Irish Sea. The more general point is perhaps that the British-Irish relationship has long been defined in terms of international analogies and comparisons. In the 19th century, Irish nationalists are looking to Central Europe, to Austria-Hungary, well, there's Arthur Griffith, of course, with the Habsburg Empire and its reform in 1867. But other Irish nationalists are looking at other continental European and wider exemplars as models for progressing, for advancing the reform of the British-Irish relationship.
Maybe we'll shift from that international context back to Ireland itself. And before we open things up to questions, I think we should consider what was the importance of the Boundary Commission to all of this before we shift over to the question period.
The British were deeply embarrassed by Ulster. George said, we have a very weak case. Lord Birkenhead said exactly the same. We can't hold on to our demands as the British, if the Irish want a settlement as they do. And the British were determined that there would be no force used against Ulster, but by Ulster they meant the 4 Unionist counties. Force could certainly be used against the 2 marginally nationalist counties, but they were embarrassed by it. They wanted to get it out of the way, sweep it under the carpet. And above all, they wanted to avoid a break on that question where they would feel weak. They wanted a break on the question of the king, of sovereignty, of the empire. That would appeal much more to British public opinion. So Lloyd George was particularly clever in developing and expanding the idea of a boundary commission. No plebiscites, there was to be no referenda. That was ruled out. But let us have a commission. And this slowly grew so that it would work in both directions, not just taking territory from the north, but also probably taking territory from the south. And Griffith, most unwisely, said, well, we would prefer a plebiscite, but a boundary commission is more or less the same thing. As things turned out, it wasn't. But it got Lloyd George off the hook.
And I've got a question here actually from our audience. Jim O'Leary is asking, did the Irish Cabinet's continued focus on external association cause the negotiators to take their eyes off the ball and fail to recognise the weakness in relying on the wording around the Boundary Commission to deliver Fermanagh and Tyrone?
Well, I don't think the Cabinet didn't discuss these issues in any serious. There's no meeting of the Dáil during the treaty debates, so the Dáil was in abeyance, if you like. The Cabinet didn't. After all, there were only 4 members left in the Cabinet. 3 of them were in London as part of the negotiating team. So it was a case of De Valera giving instructions or communicating on a daily basis with Griffith and other contacts as well. It wasn't as if there was a Cabinet in Dublin directing things. There were meetings, of course, of the 4 surviving, the remaining, not surviving, the 4 remaining members of the Cabinet in Dublin. But I think the question of the Boundary Commission was effectively a separate issue. And it wasn't discussed in any serious way at all, not until the settlement was finally reached. And then, of course, it became a crucial matter. For some people, but right through the oil debates, and this is something that will be taken up at the next session, I've no doubt, the main question was not partition. It wasn't about partition, it was the oath of the king.
And I just come back to the point that I made earlier. I think with the Boundary Commission, they were under such huge pressure from every direction, trying to keep their eye on everything, that to see something parcelled out neatly and transferred to another set of negotiations or whatever it was attractive, to say the least.
I very much agree with that. I think that I think the Boundary Commission, to a greater or lesser extent, and certainly I agree with Michael in Lloyd George's case to a greater extent, but I think for everybody it gets people off the hook because it enables the progress that has been made on other issues to be banked, and it puts off to the future an extraordinarily complex issue that has bedeviled the British-Irish relationship and indeed internal Irish relationships for at least the previous 10 years. So it's a device by which, as I say, the other progress that has been achieved can be consolidated, and it puts off to the future a very, very intractable issue. It's very, very, I think, representative of Lloyd Georgian diplomacy. It's very representative of Lloyd Georgian diplomacy with Irish politicians in 1916 or in the past. It's very, very representative of his diplomatizing in industrial relations in the pre-war period. But even if you look to 1916, partition is effectively, the decision on partition is to be postponed to some indefinite future. What he's selling to Redmond in 1916 is that this will be a short-term future. What he's selling to Carson and the Unionists in 1916 is that it will be a much longer-term future. So it's about banking what you've got and then postponing the kind of the difficult bits to the future.
I've got another question here on a different topic. This is from Jerry White. How did the military situation in Ireland, meaning the IRA versus the British Crown forces, and Lloyd George's threat of war influence the plenipotentiary's decision to sign the Articles of Agreement?
Well, the Irish leaders weren't confident of their ability to win a new round. For example, to take a very obvious case, Collins was now a public figure. He wouldn't be able to act in his old Scarlet Pimpernel role. The Irish felt that if the war is resumed, the British will make a very, very serious, tough effort, and we face problems ahead. So they didn't want a resumption. They thought, maybe rightly, maybe not, we don't know, they thought that if they held out, the British would make further concessions. They didn't want any resumption of the war. And the British were prepared for a very serious, tough, brutal war if fighting were resumed. Now, some people feel that Lloyd George should not have threatened war, that this was monstrous, that the agreement was reached under duress. I can't accept that argument at all. I mean, if you have a conflict and then a truce, and the truce breaks down, the conflict resumes. That is perfectly natural. It was an obvious tactic for Lloyd George to say, if there is no agreement, there will be war within 3 days. And being a very clever man, he didn't let that obvious opportunity slip. But it would have been a very tough war, a very brutal war, and there's no reason to think the Irish would have won. And if it had resumed over the question of the crown and sovereignty rather than partition, British public opinion would have felt, in large part, the Irish were unreasonable. They were given Dominion status, which is far more than had ever been on offer before. So the war has to resume.
And I think as well that it's very easy with 100 years of hindsight to decide that they should or shouldn't have been upset by the threat of war. But actually, Kathleen McKenna, in her description of them, just as human beings under a lot of pressure in that house in London, listening to this, and also at one remove from their support system in Dublin, I suppose it's hard to assess how threatened they felt at that particular stage.
I think that as has been said, the Sinn Fein leadership and the plenipotentiaries in particular are very pessimistic about the chances of military success. Both Collins and Mulcahy are relatively downbeat on the prospects of any short-term victory. And I think that's a very, very important influence on Collins in particular in terms of the ultimate signing of the document. I think as well, Collins and others are very clear that the truce and the whole process of negotiation is not without its military difficulties, insofar as what had been effectively a secret army fighting a guerrilla campaign is now, to some extent, brought out into the open. Collins has his minders and guards, in going over to London. These are now kind of publicly exposed, as it were, as indeed are the many who are joining the ranks of the IRA in the truce period. So a secret army has become a much less secret army, and therefore a relatively more exposed army. And this, I think, plus this recognition, Collins does recognize this, plus I think his overall sense of the standing of the campaign in June, July 1921. These are important pressures on him.
And we've got other questions here from Naomi Caligaro. She was wondering if the panel could please comment on the role of Winston Churchill.
Well, Churchill was involved in Irish politics for a very long time. He had, of course, been a Liberal member of the cabinet, but at an early stage, as early as 1911, two of the leading figures in that Liberal cabinet, Churchill and Lloyd George, had eventually come around to the idea of separate treatment for Ulster. So Churchill was not an advocate of Irish nationalism, certainly not an advocate of Irish unity, but he didn't play as prominent a role in the treaty negotiations as might have been expected. He was more important later in 1922 as Secretary of State for the Colonies, the minister responsible for dealing with the provisional government. He was there in the background, involved in discussions with Collins and with Griffith, taking a tough line, but not in many ways as tough as Lloyd George. And even before the truce, Lloyd George, a Liberal, had been far more radical, far more determined in his opposition to concessions than some of the Conservatives. At that stage, Churchill, of course, was still a Liberal. His Conservative phase came only later, after 1924. So he was a formidable figure, but it was Lloyd George and not Churchill, not Austen Chamberlain, the leader of the Conservative Party. It was Lloyd George who made the running in 1921.
Okay, thanks for that. And we'll just look here, we've got other ones here. Somebody else is asking, how was Collins, Paul Nugent is asking, how was Collins as a negotiator? And wondering, does his performance in London tell us anything about how he might have been as a politician had he lived beyond 1922? Or is that
Will I go?
I think that's Michael again.
Okay, he was to be impetuous. Lloyd George was sometimes dismissive of him, regarded him as wild, untamed, and so on. And he did once or twice quarrel ostentatiously with his fellow delegates, which was not a clever thing to do, and stayed at home, avoided going to key meetings. On the other hand, he and Griffith were the two who carried out all the negotiations. He learned an enormous amount. He learned what Dominion status was like. He learned how to manage his British counterparts, who came to have increasing respect for him as time went on. And there's no doubt that he was much better prepared in January 1922 to become a head of government than he had been in October 1921 when he first went to London. And he proved, as we know, in many ways, a shrewd, ruthless, highly manipulative, and therefore promising head of a government in 1922. And I think the negotiations between October and December 21 were sort of a training course for him.
And again, just to say, in looking back at all of this, there is always a tendency to try and, I think, maybe overanalyze the personalities of everybody involved, in that I think you need to compare it to politics today. And people are good at some things and they're hopeless at other things. And we shouldn't ascribe too many attributes to people just because they became famous subsequently. But I think we need to remember that, as I said, politics is a very complicated game, and militant politics is even more so.
He's still very young, of course, so he is, he's politically speaking, evolving and educating himself. He's politically realistic, I think, more so than perhaps some others within the Sinn Fein leadership. That political realism comes, as we've said already, from a sense, well, from his strong anchorage within the IRB and within the military campaign. So he, his networks are, of course, it need hardly be said, extraordinary. And he has a gift for personal friendship, which of course is important within the separatist movement, but actually is potentially important more widely. He and Birkenhead, for example, F.E. Smith, have a quirkily respectful relationship, as some of Collins's correspondence, if I remember correctly, attest. So he's got a gift for friendship. He's got a gift for his networks in Ireland are superb. He's on an upward curve, I think. So I think I think there's much that was promising there.
And I've got another question here that ties in with, again, one of the real stickling points, the things that would really rankle back in Ireland. Did the Irish side not appreciate how important the oath was to the British, in that the crown was seen as a symbol of the people of the British Empire, in the same way as the Republic was a symbol of the people of the 26 counties?
Well, the British had been determined that there would be an oath of allegiance to the king right until the very last few days, and then it was diluted somewhat. But it's significant that not only was the treaty attacked in the Dáil because of the king being written into the agreement, it was also attacked in the House of Commons and the House of Lords because there was no oath of allegiance to the king, an oath of fidelity to the king, an oath of allegiance to the constitution of the Irish Free State. But the British did make a concession that some conservatives felt went too far. And some of the conservatives never forgave Lloyd George for what was seen as his surrender. And it took them another 11 months until October 1922 to get rid of him. But when an opportunity arose, they did get rid of him. And in the background all the time was what was seen as his betrayal of British interests in the treaty, including giving way on the oath. There had to be an oath, but it was a different oath from that sworn in all the other dominions. And therefore it was regarded as a second-class sort of oath to the king.
I think, again, the deal, so far as the British were concerned, was laid out pretty clearly in July 1921 between Lloyd George and De Valera. And this, I think, takes us back to the start of our conversation. So the terms of the settlement, so far as the British were concerned, were outlined pretty explicitly in those conversations between Lloyd George and De Valera as early as July 1921. And on the whole, the British don't budge from that position, albeit that they are prepared to tweak in the way that Michael has just described. So if memory serves, Birkenhead, whom I mentioned earlier, was responsible for modifying the oath from the British side to make it slightly more palatable to the Sinn Fein plenipotentiaries. But I think that, what this question emphasizes, I think, more generally, is just the importance of symbolism, for all of those around the conference table between October and December 1921. The importance of the oath, the importance of the symbolism of the Republic, the importance of the symbolism of the crown, so far as the British were concerned.
And do we have time for just one last question? And it would be for you, Alvin, from Heather Jones. How much was James Craig kept informed of the talks as they were happening?
Thank you, Heather. James Craig was certainly in critical stages of the talks, kept pretty much in the dark. So there's a period between the beginning of November 1921 and the actual signing of the treaty in December 1921 when there is very little communication a toll between Lloyd George and the Northern Unionist representatives. So Craig is ensconced in London, in the Constitutional Club in Northumberland Avenue, close to Westminster. So he's in a position to hear kind of tidbits and to hear gossip, but in terms of formal and direct communication, it's very, very on and off. And it's only relatively late in the day as well that the Northern Ireland Parliament and Executive, which has been created in June 1921, begins to have powers transferred to it. So there's a kind of complex set of pluses and minuses so far as Craig is concerned. He's beginning in November 1921 to get some powers transferred to him, but he's not being kept in the loop systematically as to the progress of the negotiations, and he only sees a draft of the treaty very, very late in the day.
Thank you for that. And we're really at the end of our time there. I'd like to thank our speakers for a fantastic discussion. I'd also like to say to those of you who had put questions in the Q&A box that we didn't get to, some of those questions might be quite relevant in the sessions to come later today. So please try again later on. So again, thank you to our speakers. Really, really wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
I think it is now time to hand over to Jennifer Redmond.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for that wonderful session. You all have shared with us amazing insights, and I certainly learned a lot. Even though I study this quite a bit and teach it myself, I still learned something, so I hope you did too. This is the official time for our coffee break. And that means that we will be putting a placeholder side there and coming back for the next session at 10:55, which I will introduce properly then. Just to let you know, if you have to step away from the event at any point, just remember that this will appear on the Houses of the Oireachtas website and the Royal Irish Academy's website at a later date once it's ready. So thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you to our speakers and our chair, and we will see you at 10:55. Many thanks to all of you for your kind attention. We're moving on now to session 2, which explores the treaty debates themselves. So we've set the scene for you in our last session for the preamble, the negotiations, and the different characters involved. But now we want to take more of a look at the language, the atmosphere, and what was said. And of course, some of you will remember some very famous quotes from the debates, and I think those will come up, particularly in some of the research work that our panelists have done. But I'm very happy now to hand over to the chair for the session, Anya Lawler from RTE. Very many thanks for chairing this session.
Jennifer, thank you very much indeed, and you're all very welcome. I'm Anya Lawler, as Jennifer said there. So this is the treaty debates, and our 3 panelists. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Caoimhe Nic Dávid from Sheffield University. Dr. Nic Dávid is a lecturer in modern history at the University of Sheffield. She specialises in the history of the Irish Revolution and the history of political violence and terrorism. And Caoimhe's books include Terrorist Histories, Individuals and Political Violence Since the 19th Century. You're very welcome, Caoimhe. Also with us, Dr. Liam Weeks from the Department of Government in UCC, and he's also Honorary Research, Senior Research Fellow at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Macquarie University in Sydney. And Liam's books include All Politics is Local, and with Micheál O'Flaherty, Birth of a State, the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Good morning, Liam. And finally, to introduce to you Professor Bill Kissan, political scientist and historian who's a reader in politics at the London School of Economics, where he's a member of the Conflict Research Group, and his books include The Politics of the Irish Civil War and Nations Torn Asunder, The Challenge of the Civil War. So thank you all for joining us. I'm looking forward to the next hour. And as I say, online questions are going to be welcome throughout the session. Now, let's set the scene first, and I'd like to hear from each of you on this. The achievement of the treaty, or the failure of the treaty, as some thought coming into this debate. So let's set the scene, bring us back to that winter. Bill, to begin.
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me on this panel. I think as already been discussed, the treaty was a compromise. So as a compromise, it can be seen as a great achievement, and it can also be seen as a disappointment. But I think in the long-term perspective, in order to understand what it means as a kind of milestone in the history of Irish nationalism, I would quote James Joyce when he said that the Irish were the most belated nation in Europe. And I think what he meant by that was that in the late 18th century, there was this rebellion or rising against British rule, but it was followed by the Act of Union. And between 1800 and 1921, Ireland was seen internationally as a domestic question of the United Kingdom. And this changed between 1916 and the treaty. And I think the first thing that changed it was that the rising itself redefined the nature of the conflict in Ireland as being one between the British state and Irish nationalism, as opposed to what it was under the Home Rule period between Unionism and nationalism within Ireland. And secondly, I think when the offer of Dominion status came in the summer of 1921, all of a sudden, the Irish issue was clearly not just a domestic issue for the British Empire, it was an international question. So I think two things that follow, which are really important for understanding the treaty debates. The first is the intense preoccupation with the status of this new state. And secondly, I think that in the background, what you saw with the treaty was, for the first time in centuries, the gradual departure of the British Army from Ireland. So if you want to consider it very crudely in terms of what the treaty achieved, it did achieve the departure of the British Army from Ireland, and it was on that basis that the more realistic case for the treaty was made.
Liam, what's your take on the context in which the treaty debates were taking place, both in Ireland and internationally?
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. I think we need to look at this from two perspectives. Certainly many Republicans who opposed the treaty, looking at this from an Irish perspective, they obviously saw the treaty as failure, and that's why they opposed it. You know, they harked back to what Pádraig Pearse and what members of their political party had fought for in 1916. But too often, especially both in Irish politics and Irish history, we are guilty of viewing things from a very Irish nationalist lens perspective. If we view this from the international perspective and we consider what was happening in Europe post-World War I, and let's be honest, when we talk about the treaty, you know, it's an international document. It is part of what's going on in the wider world. Empires had collapsed and crumbled in Europe. Many new countries had emerged. So Woodrow Wilson, the US president, had talked about gaining self-determination for nations. And certainly those involved in the treaty negotiations and those members of the Dáil, that's what they looked to. They looked to the examples of smaller states in Europe that had become republics. But again, this is where we need to look at this through a third perspective, which is the British perspective. The reason why these countries became republics was because empires had collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the British Empire, of course, had not collapsed. And the British Empire was not in the habit of allowing members of the empire to leave freely and become republics. We just saw this week, Barbados became a republic, but didn't leave the Commonwealth. For such a thing to be even contemplated 100 years ago was just not an issue. And I think this was one of the reasons why, this is one of the main, obviously, reasons why the treaty was attacked. But it's clear from reading the discussions of what Griffith and Collins were thinking about, and this is one of the reasons why De Valera didn't go to the negotiations in London. They just knew the Republic was never going to be an option. So if you look at it from a British lens, this was the greatest concession from a British government since the Treaty of Paris that granted American independence. So from that perspective, certainly you could see the treaty as a success.
And Caoimhe, what's your take on the context, both for those who were attending the debates and, you know, in the context of the shared struggle they'd come through, and also internationally?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Bill and Liam have said, but we did hear in the previous panel, if you look at what the British proposed in the documents from July 1921, when they're setting out the initial basis for talks about talks, it's a phrase we've heard before, though that had happened before the formal negotiations began in October 1921. They don't move very much from July what they propose in July to what is signed in December. So from that perspective, you know, the Irish delegation failed really to move the British opening position all that much, and that's something we might talk about a little bit later. But I do agree, though, that there have been significant advances in the British position before that. So if you look at what members of the Lloyd George cabinet were, the Conservative members of the Lloyd George cabinet were proposing to do in 1912, 1913, 1914, proposing to rip up the British Constitution in order to prevent Home Rule in Ireland. And by 1920 and 1921, they are part of a coalition government that has voted in 2 measures of Home Rule in Ireland for both North and South. And then they go farther and they accept Dominion status for Ireland. Even as late as October 1920, Lloyd George himself is making key policy speeches, which are reported extensively in the international press, saying that Dominion status is never going to happen for Ireland. So the British also move quite a bit, but they don't move really after July. And that maybe is why the treaty is viewed with such disappointment in Republican circles in Ireland, because that opening negotiating point is not really advanced upon all that significantly by the Irish delegation.
And before we talk more about, you know, the themes and the debate itself, set the scene for me, Caoimhe, because, you know, when you read back the transcripts of the debate, you know, the drama leaps off the printed page. It really does. So talk to me about the atmosphere and as they all gathered for those debates.
Yeah, so the treaties begin on the 14th of December and they conclude on the 7th of January. There is a break for Christmas in the middle of that period, and we'll talk about the significance of that break a little later, I think. But the debates, although we can read all the transcripts now, you know, there's a very full historical record of exactly what was said, but the debates when they happened were divided into public sessions and private sessions. So the public sessions were reported almost verbatim in the press. The private sessions were obviously closed sessions, not open to the public, and the public didn't know what was going on in those private sessions. Now, there was some dispute over whether there should be any private sessions at all. There was a sense, certainly from some pro-treatyites, that, you know, whatever I have to say, I'll say it in front of, you know, all of the Irish people. I'm not afraid of saying anything publicly. But others were concerned that, you know, you shouldn't air dirty laundry in public. We shouldn't give the British a sense of any possible divisions within our movement. And especially maybe if we're talking frankly about the condition of the IRA and the capacity to resume military conflict, we don't want to give anything away in those circumstances. So it is important to remember that there were both public and both private sessions. But you know, the holding slide that we just saw was of a crowd waiting outside Earlsfort Terrace University buildings, now the National Gallery of Ireland. That's where the debates were held. And you know, people thronged the streets waiting to see the deputies going in. And even for the private sessions, newspaper reporters reported on the demeanor, the facial expressions, whether their mood sounded good or sounded bad, you know, whether they appeared to be in a good mood or a bad mood. So poring over any kind of hint of what might be unfolding behind those closed doors. So it was sort of a pressure cooker atmosphere, I would say, as well. You could hear cheers from the outside as you know, certain delegates went, or certain TDs went in or went out. So a real sense that everyone in Ireland was watching these debates and was trying to get a sense of how things might go.
And, you know, conscious as well that this is, you know, the vision of the 1916 Irish Republic coming up against the reality of the treaty, the settlement that had been reached. So in those debates, let's talk now about the themes that, you know, were actually selected. What mattered to them at the time? What were the issues that were moving them? Bill?
Well, I think, as you've said, it's quite important to realise that this wasn't a normal parliament. This was a revolutionary parliament where a large number of the members had taken part in the campaign against the British. Many had been involved in the 1916 Rising. So if you conceive of it as a debate in which the vaunted ideals of Irish republicanism had to come to terms with reality, this was obviously going to be something that was going to involve quite a readjustment on the part of many people. Now, what were the basic issues? I think the most important thing is to note the intense preoccupation with status, the question of Dominion status versus Republic, and why this preoccupation with status was so important. But I also think it's important to realize that although the treaty kind of accepted partition for the time being, very little attention was actually paid in the debate to the issue of partition. So the question of status was obviously much more important than the question of partition. There was also at the very beginning a very bitter kind of division of opinion as to what the plenipotentiaries had done in London, whether they should have signed the document, whether they should have consulted with De Valera and so forth. So straight away, even before they met to debate the treaty, the divisions among the leaders, with Collins emerging as the figurehead on the pro-treaty side and De Valera feeling that his authority was being usurped, this was a dominating theme in the early part of the debate. And then we get on to the question of the Christmas recess and the fact that many people who were not very familiar with the constituents who had elected them were meeting with their constituents. They came under pressure from the clergy. The media came out in favor of the treaty, the national newspapers. So the question of majority rule and democracy was added to the debate over the treaty. But I think if I had to talk about what the issues were, I would go back to a statement I read in a history book about the nature of British political debate in 1914 and the way in which at the elite level, the debate in Britain was about three things: empire, freedom, and democracy. And I think more or less that was what the Dáil was debating as well.
Liam, what's your take on the issues that were raised during the debate and what they say to us now?
I'll be honest, my reading of the debates, it is a bit depressing. The quality of the debate was pretty poor. Maybe it's not something nationalist Republican Ireland always wants to hear. On the very first day of the debates, over 40 TDs spoke. Owen McNeill, who was the Ceann Comhairle, he was continuously interrupting members, saying, can you please address the issue? Members didn't really want to talk about the issues of the day. At times, several members wanted to settle old scores. There was significant animosity between Cathal Brugha and Michael Collins, between Arthur Griffith and Erskine Childers. On the first day of the debates, I have here a quote from the Ceann Comhairle, Owen McNeill, and he expressed the hope that a real effort will be made to conduct this discussion in future in every way worthy of the nation in which we belong to. The Irish Times reported of the first day's proceedings that they must have disappointed, if not alarmed, the country. Some key issues were not discussed. Bill mentioned partition. Of the public debates, only 9 of the 338 pages of public debates discuss partition. Of the private debates, when we might think people would say where they really stood in relation to the North, such as maybe let's go across there and let's invade, only 3 of the 183 pages talked about the North. It's almost as if the North didn't exist. It's almost as if they didn't want to discuss it. It's remarkable reading the debates. It's almost as if, you know, it bears a lot of comparison to the current discussions about the North. It goes back to really some of the issues that people have talked in relation to unionism from the previous 10 years of the Irish Revolution. I mean, so I have been saying on you the issues that were not discussed. The economy, Ireland was going to, you know, they wanted this republic. And I know the previous panel talked about this. There was no discussion of what is a republic? You know, what kind of government are we going to have? No discussion about the economy. I've done a kind of quantitative textual analysis of the debates. Economy, industry, economics was discussed, mentioned 36 times out of 500,000 words. The issues that were discussed on here were about oath, the king, the monarch, and so on. Very much symbolic things. What we should say is the issues that the anti-treaty Republicans mentioned, within 10, 15 years, most of them were gone. The oath disappeared in the 1930s. Ireland left the Commonwealth in the 1940s. You know, ironically, in terms of the one big issue in terms of partition, that was not discussed. As we know, that wasn't a resolve from a nationalist perspective. And in terms of the economy, many argued it wasn't until Ireland joined a different union, again in the 1970s, that the economy actually took off. Now, in fairness to the TDs, these people, just as we've, accusations have been leveled against current groups of TDs, they were not economic experts. Most of the Dáil, and Bill mentioned, and Queeve as well, when they first met, they didn't know what was in this treaty. You know, many of the TDs were simply lackeys who'd been picked by Collins. You know, it's remarkable in which there was a core elite in Sinn Fein who knew what was going on, but many of the other TDs simply just weren't aware. Because as well, as Bill mentioned, This was a revolutionary parliament. Not a single member had had their seat contested. They were all unelected, unopposed. And you might say, well, that's because everyone backed Sinn Fein. Well, I'm sorry, at the election in June 1922, the first election after the treaty, 40% of the electorate voted for candidates not from Sinn Fein. So where were these people? Maybe if we'd had Labour representatives, Unionist representatives, farmers representatives, we would have had a more diverse debate. And you know, the consequences then, maybe there would have been less of a split over the treaty.
Caoimhe, what's your take on the issues, you know, that feature in the debates and the ones, you know, that Liam's been talking about there that significantly didn't?
Yeah, I mean, it's very striking to our eyes today how little partition features, and it tends to be some of the, like Sean McEntee, who was from Belfast, he talked about partition. He was one of the few who did. But then there are other Ulster TDs like Eoin O'Duffy who say, you know, I know what Ulster's like, and I know that I have faced Ulster lead, and I have, you know, faced it down, and I, you know, this treaty is the best way to go ahead and deal with partition. So Liam is right that it's not substantively discussed. But I think, you know, there are a number of levels of reality and unreality that existed in the Irish revolutionary movement. And, you know, it is a fact that the Northern Irish Parliament was already up and running by the time of the treaty debates. It had opened in June. It is also, I think, a fact that most TDs believed, as it seems the Irish delegation themselves believed, that the Boundary Commission would rule substantively in favour of the Free State, would grant substantial amounts of territory back to the Free State, and would therefore make Northern Ireland unviable. So that, you know, the Boundary Commission would take care of the partition problem. You're still left with the treaty, you know, one way or the other. So let's focus on what's objectionable in the treaty. So that's sort of my take on the partition question. I think it is fair to say that fiscal issues and economic issues, as Liam talked about, aren't really discussed. And it's quite interesting if we think of the longer history of proposed measures of Irish self-government. We know that fiscal issues are one of the thorniest, most tortuous issues that happen during the Government of Ireland, or the Home Rule Acts, you know, particularly the third Home Rule Bill. Who's paying for what? Who's responsible for what pensions? What tax raising powers, you know, a Home Rule Ireland would have? And that's actually somewhere that the treaty goes a lot farther than the Home Rule Bills did. You know, there is no question about kind of an independent fiscal policy that the Irish Free State would have. They did secure that concession. But it doesn't feature very widely, and we, you know, as Bill also said, the obsession with status, with symbolism, and I don't think any panelists here have done this, but I think we shouldn't think they were, you know, chasing after shadows, and this was, you know, they were chasing after, you know, meaningless things. These things mattered deeply to people. These things were part of their political ideology. These things were reasons why they had mobilized themselves to join a revolution and to go and fight in a revolution. So I don't think, you know, we can talk about bread and butter issues, which are important, but we shouldn't undercut, I think, the significance that immensely important symbols like the oath, like the king, like the Governor General held for people at the time.
And Bill, you've mentioned as well, let's talk now about the Christmas break and, you know, the context of public opinion, you know, the press at the time and the pressure that was coming on there. And you know, because we've already heard about, you know, the huge amount of media attention at the time that was focused on these debates.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, once the treaty was signed, it became on both sides a battle for public opinion. And it seems as if the pro-treaty side were winning that battle for public opinion almost from the word go. And what was happening during the Christmas recess, which was just under 2 weeks, was that the press and particularly the Catholic Church were very influential in basically putting pressure on the TDs to take a stand in favor of the treaty. And the church was especially important because it basically argued that, you know, you can't go against public opinion. Public opinion is in favor of the settlement. Secondly, you are morally obliged to basically vote in favor of the treaty if public opinion is what it is. And thirdly, there is no alternative to this treaty. This is actually a very generous reading. So it's an opportunity, I think, for the Catholic Church to come back and start reshaping nationalist politics in a way they didn't do very successfully since 1917 or 1916. And it adds to the case for the treaty, this question of majority rule. But I must say there is this debate, I suppose, retrospectively, had the church not exercised this pressure on the TDs, would the small majority in favor of the treaty actually have resulted? And I don't know, there are people like Harry Boland, for example, who were definitely put under pressure by individual clerics who didn't change his mind on the treaty and voted against the treaty, and addressed this question very specifically and said that I wasn't lying, I wasn't inconsistent when I said I was standing for the Republic, and I am maintaining that consistent opinion. So it's a battle for public opinion that goes on really until late June. And you could say what happens in this period of time is that it begins this split over the treaty as very much a split. As Liam said, there was a small nucleus of people within Sinn Fein and the IRA who controlled everything. And as time went on and the treaty debates helped amplify this, it became a kind of broader struggle for public opinion. And I think the Christmas recess, it did influence some people. I mean, some people said they were influenced by the views of their constituents. So, but how much of an influence it had, I don't know.
Yeah,
Peter, you want to come in there?
Yeah, I just want to come back in there. I just want to add something to the mix. Don't necessarily disagree with anything Bill is saying. And I think there are really important questions to be asked about how we're conceptualizing democracy and legitimacy in the treaty debates. And I do want to come back to that a bit later. And I'm not disagreeing that there was pressure exerted on TDs. Clearly there was, but there was also, there were hundreds of public bodies, county council, different representative public bodies who were passing resolutions in favor of the treaty during that Christmas break or before the final vote. Now, that's not to say that the church wasn't in turn pressurizing them. I suppose that could be a valid response to that. But my sense of public opinion in Ireland in December 1921 is that people are weary of the war. People are reluctant to go back. I mean, it's hard to go back to war after 6 months of truce. That is a hard thing for people to do. And this clearly weighs on the minds of the deputies, this question of, do we go back to war? What would war mean? Can the people of Ireland take it? Should we be asking them to take it? That's a theme that comes up again and again as well. So I suppose I don't see the public. I think there is something of a groundswell of public opinion in favor of the treaty. I don't see it necessarily as just being sort of marshaled or kind of coaxed along by vested interests in society, which might have been part of what Bill was suggesting. I think they're part of it, but I do think there is a kind of grassroots swell in favor of the treaty as well. Now that raises the other question, who are the TDs representing? Are they representing constituents? There's complexities about, who voted for them. As Liam pointed out, nobody actually voted for a Sinn Féin TD. Nobody voted in the second Dáil elections because constituencies were not contested. So are they representing their constituents? Are they representing, there's a high proportion of TDs who are also officers in the IRA. Are they representing their fellow volunteers? Those who are TDs, a revolutionary vanguard, who are necessarily in advance of where public opinion might be because they need to kind of show the public the way that the public will then follow. All of those issues I don't think are easy to disentangle. And I don't think it's easy to say, this perspective is the correct one, this perspective was the incorrect and the illegitimate one. But I think those are all issues that are entangled in the treaty debates. And it's part of why it's such an interesting period for historians to go back to.
Yeah, and that whole question of where people, get their mandate from, how they've arrived at the position that they're at. What's your take on it, Liam, in terms of, the war weariness that was undoubtedly there to some part, the role of the church, and also it's the beginning, isn't it, of the issue, the questioning of legitimacy that's going to be so critical in the months and indeed years ahead.
Absolutely, Anya. And I do agree with lots of Caoimh's point, I think though in defence of the TDs now, having kind of criticised them in my previous comment, we can be guilty of, transposing contemporary understandings and contemporary values of democracy onto a period 100 years ago. When remember, there were very few what we would call democratic states in the world. It was clear at the time that it wasn't just public opinion, that many public bodies, hundreds of public bodies, in fact, as Griffith said, came out in support of the treaty, which begs the question then, why was the treaty passed so very narrowly by 64 votes to 57? In fact, what if 4 TDs had changed their mind? What would have been the implications then if the Dáil had rejected the treaty when the public was in favour of it? I suppose this brings into, and again, trying to draw contemporary examples. If we think about Brexit, that was put to a public vote, which actually was not binding. What if there had been such a plebiscite in Ireland at the time? Interestingly, no one was really talking about it. And now, while we might say, well, plebiscites weren't that common, they had been used, for example, to decide on borders in Europe post-World War. They had been used in Norway. So Norway left the constitutional monarchy of Norway and of the Kingdom of Sweden in 1905. They had 2 plebiscites on leaving that particular kingdom. What if there had been such a public talk or such a public vote? Then, of course, begs the question, who would have had the vote? Would the vote have been extended to women? Would it have been extended to people below the age of 30, property holders?
It'd still be arguing about that now.
Absolutely. If I can just say, there was one particular nice study done by Uno Halpin and Mary Staines in a previous work I edited, and they looked at the background of TDs, and they found that of this, there were 122 TDs present in that second Dáil. Of 69 who were born or brought up in the constituency they represented, the split in favour of the treaty was 42-27. For the TDs, of the 50 TDs who had no such links, the split was 22-28. So in fact, this kind of does suggest there is some evidence that they were listening to what the constituents were saying. Mm-hmm. Interesting. De Valera had told TDs, don't talk about the treaty over the Christmas debate. He wanted people to remain silent. Maybe he was conscious that public opinion was particularly in favour of this document. Just one final point I should say though, the greatest cheers and the greatest level of public celebration didn't come for the treaty, Anya. It came for the truce in July 1921. And it's quite stark how much the public celebrated the truce and the ending of the war. And then when the treaty came in, there was tumbleweed. Where were the celebrations? If we think about this, was the moment where Pearse and Parnell and O'Connell had all failed. This is where the independent Irish state had been achieved. So it does echo back to Caoimh's point. Maybe it was just a sense of weariness as opposed to a sense of great enthusiasm for this document.
And indeed, as Jerry White has pointed out, Bill, in his comments, they were also dealing with a pandemic at the time, in the middle of all of this, quite apart from everything going on in terms of the Spanish flu. What's your take on, you mentioned the role of the church. There was the issue, obviously, of the war weariness, the background pandemic and so on. But how TDs and those debates spoke about mandate or where they thought they were getting their mandate from to vote the way they did?
Well, of course, as Caoimh said, the question of democracy and the questions of legitimacy and so forth are very complicated. And the simplest answer to that is from the pro-treaty point of view, which is, I suppose, articulated by Collins when he said that basically he wouldn't commit the Irish people to war unless they themselves committed themselves to war. So that gives a sense of what mandate might mean from that perspective, that we couldn't continue on with this revolutionary struggle without being popularly authorized by the people. But there's a different point of view, and it's a completely consistent point of view as well, which is to say a mandate had already been given in 1918 for an alternative to Dominion status, which was a republic. And I suppose the De Valera point of view is that the only reason people would accept the treaty is because external force is operative and they're not in a free position to either choose their own form of government or their relationships with the British Empire under the treaty. And that is basically reducing the question of democracy to that of self-determination. And then there's a kind of third perspective, which we might again think is quite outlandish, which is to say that the question of who is sovereign in this case is also influenced by the fact that people have died for things. So to some extent, the dead are sovereign. And you can dismiss that and say that this is completely undemocratic. But how else are you going to explain why this small rising in 1916 kicked off this independence movement, unless you take into account that martyrdom and this kind of idea that what was driving the movement forward was the fact that people were willing to die for things, and therefore we should respect this. And so this was expressed by some politicians as well, which is that basically we are to some extent limited in what we can do by the fact that people have died for things. And this is a very important, I think, emotional kind of understanding of where people are getting their authority from. And I think really the ultimate kind of point, I suppose, that De Valera made, which is that you can argue to and fro about the merits of the treaty in practical terms. But the point about the pro-treaty argument, he argued, was that it ignored the sentiment which underpinned the independence movement. And this idea that the sentiment was just as important as the level of politics or the level of constitutional ideas, I think that's really key to this debate as well.
Liam, were they talking past each other? You know, were pro-treaty TDs making one kind of argument and anti-treaty TDs making another, or were they engaging with each other's points of view?
Yeah, so Anya, so coming from a political science background, I've engaged in the last couple of years in a kind of quantitative textual analysis of the debates, because what's often forgotten is, unlike, let's say, many political debates in Parliament where not many TDs are present, I hasten to say, as many as possible who could have been there were there. Most of them spoke, only 24 of the 122 didn't speak. I was really interested, I was applying, so I used essentially the 500,000 words that were spoken, and I divided up the Dáil into anti-treaty and pro-treaty TDs, just to see was there any differences. So for example, I used a tool called sentiment analysis. This is often used by businesses to determine if people are speaking favorably about a product. It codes data, which are words, as positive or negative. Interestingly, I found that, maybe not surprisingly, 3/4 of speeches were actually negative in tone, but there were no divisions between the pro-treaty and anti-treatyites. The pro-treatyites were pretty much just as negative about the document as the anti-treatyites. And of course, this shouldn't come as a surprise, because even Collins himself said, look, it's not the best settlement, but it is a stepping stone. A second tool I used was, I considered, well, how complex were the debates? How easy were they to follow? This is often used, for example, in studies of populist leaders in recent times, to see if, populists use more simple language of the people and so on. And again, the expectation here was maybe that the likes of De Valera, especially, and Childers would have used more arcane, complex language. But again, I didn't find any differences between the anti-treatyites and pro-treatyites. And a third method I used on you was to determine, well, maybe are there policy differences between the anti-treatyites and pro-treatyites? We can't always look at what they directly said. We have to see is there some meaning behind their particular statement. So for example, maybe would the pro-treatyites have been more centre-right, the anti-treatyites be more centre-left? I used a particular technique that codes words as meanings to determine policy preferences. But again, I did not find any differences between pro-treatyites and anti-treatyites, which then, of course, Anya, begs the big question, on what basis did they actually split? What was the reason for the divide? Especially since, as we've discussed in the previous comments, that in the public and the public bodies were largely in favour of this document.
Okay, both Caoimhe and Bill, you want to come in, and then I've got lots of questions starting to come in now.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by these political science tools which are beyond the reach of us lowly historians. It just adds a whole other lens, and I'm really interested to see that there's not a kind of obvious left-right split in the pro and anti-treaty side, at least insofar as the speeches. But I just want to go back to our question of democracy and mandate, because I think there's something important that we haven't mentioned yet, which comes up a lot in the debates themselves, which is this idea that the treaty is imposed under the threat of immediate and terrible war, Robert Barton's phrase. And, that raises a significant cloud, for me at least, as to whether this, a mandate given to a treaty under those circumstances is in fact a legitimate mandate or not. And it's they talk about it, this idea of immediate and terrible war, quite a lot in the debates themselves, and it's whether or not the people are prepared to go back to fight. anti-treatyites are saying, you know, we are prepared to go back, and I know the people of Ireland, you know, would last for 1,000 other years, 1,000 other days. And as Bill said, you know, this is what my husband, my son, my brother died for, and we cannot betray them. Margaret Pearse says she would be haunted by Patrick Pearse if she voted for that treaty. But you know, I think there's a bit of a tendency nowadays to dismiss the idea of immediate and terrible war as just a bluff, as just a negotiating tactic on the part of Lloyd George. And I think we actually need to take it more seriously. And I think it further problematizes notions of what is legitimate, where is this a truly democratic exercise, if there are people who are openly saying, I'm only voting for this treaty because I can't land immediate and terrible war on the Irish people once more. I think that that's very problematic.
Bill, you wanted to come in there, and maybe we'll also move on to the question of the women in the treaty debates.
Yeah, I had something to say really about both Liam's and Caoimhe's comments. I agree that this question of the threat of force, the coercion inherent in the treaty settlement, it makes democracy a problematic concept. And it really goes back to what the early panelists were talking about and what Caoimhe mentioned as well, the talks before talks, and De Valera saying really that you know, we deserve to have the same status as other European countries and to determine our future without external force being pressurized on us. But then you have Liam's point, which is that unlike the Ottoman, Habsburg and Tsarist empires, the British Empire hadn't collapsed in the First World War. So they were in a position to impose terms on the Irish nationalists. But the second thing I wanted to say about what Liam is saying about the lack of detail and the lack of sophistication, and to some extent the lack of science in terms of the treaty debates. I mean, again, we've got to realize this is a revolutionary parliament. These are people who weren't spending their time, you know, reading pamphlets on socioeconomic policy. It's like in Northern Ireland, you know, people who ended up in prison after being convicted for IRA membership or whatever. You know, when they were in prison, they were in a position to read books and develop their political ideology further. And so it isn't really a surprise to me that there wouldn't be this kind of sophisticated political debate on things like socioeconomic development and so forth, because this is an underground revolutionary movement that is coming out into the open. And people like Collins, I mean, don't forget that before the treaty negotiations, not everyone knew who Collins was. They had heard of him, but all of a sudden he was being photographed in London. So he was coming out in the open too. And this tension between his conspiratorial instincts and his leadership capacity as the leader of the pro-treaty side, it's pretty clear in the first part of 1922. So I would interpret it that way. Now, with respect to women, it goes back to what I was saying about the argument that, you know, my brother or my husband has been martyred for this cause, so therefore it is a sacred cause and we cannot compromise on it. All the women TDs, as far as I know, who were in the Dáil rejected the treaty. And many of them made arguments to the effect that this is not just a question of peace and war, this is a question of right and wrong. And so they were less willing to compromise on these issues than some of their male fellow TDs. And of course, this created a reaction then, particularly expressed in this book by P.S. O'Hegarty, that they were basically behaving irrationally, that they had introduced an element of irrationality because of the fact that there were women into the treaty debates. But it goes back to what Liam is saying. It's really interesting too, that we cannot find any kind of convincing socioeconomic explanation for why some groups voted for the treaty and others voted against it. And it's hard to explain it sociologically, but at the same time, we know this is the division that has lasted for 90, 100 years in terms of Irish party politics. So it's really important to try and understand really what explains, you know, people's behavior on this issue.
Caoimhe, what's your interpretation of the contributions women made in the treaty debates?
Yeah,
and about them as well.
Right. So Bill is right. All of the female TDs voted against the treaty, and many of them were widows of Irish martyrs. So you have Kathleen Clark, you have Kate O'Callaghan, the widow of murdered Lord Mayor of Dublin. You have Mary McSweeney, the sister of Terence McSweeney. You have Margaret Pearse, the mother of Patrick Pearse, and some others, and Constance Markievicz, and Ada English is the last one, I think. All those women TDs wore black for the entirety of the treaty debates. You know, they were quite a distinctive group in and of themselves. I mean, many of them were observing the conventions of mourning, of course. And the women do talk about their relationships to their dead relatives, those who had them, but many of the male TDs also talked about dead people, dead friends, dead comrades that they had had. The women also make, particularly Mary McSweeney and also Kathleen Clark, make substantive, ideological contributions as well, where they set out their rationale, their political rationale for voting against the treaty. So, you know, although this kind of caricature has developed, as Bill said, largely kind of set and trained by P.S. O'Hegarty and others, characterizing these women TDs as either entirely driven by their emotions, or as sort of, you know, betraying the normal feminine behavior of their sex and being totally cold and have no sympathy for people who might die as a result of the pursuit of this irrational, unattainable republic. I think there's two kind of tropes in how these women are spoken about: irrational or totally over emotional or totally cold. And they combine in works like O'Hegarty, but I think they make just as many kind of substantial contributions as many of the male TDs. And Mary McSweeney gives one of the longest speeches in the whole debate. She speaks for a good few hours. I'm sure Liam will have the stats there. So I think, you know, we can't dismiss them just because they had relatives who died, and just as we shouldn't dismiss TDs who spoke who, you know, happened to not be killed by the British. That's a contribution that is made about Sean McKeown, the famous IRA leader, who, you know, happened to avoid being killed in an ambush, but it could just as likely have happened to him. And he's now saying, I would have voted for the treaty, and he did go and vote for the treaty. So, you know, mobilizing the patriot dead is kind of a tricky one, and it can cut both ways, I think.
Yeah, in terms of women, let's be honest, the way in which women were portrayed in this parliament, as we mentioned with P.S. O'Hegarty, was completely sexist and misogynistic. And if we're wondering what the elites thought of women in terms of the men in the parliament, we only have to think about the state that was established. You know, you want to know the insight of W.T. Cosgrave, look at what the Cumann na Gael government did, you know, after independence. Again, just to go back to some of my kind of political science methodology, I engaged in sentiment analysis to say, you know, we were told in the 20s that women were these rabid radicals and shrieking sisters. But I just looked at all of their speeches. The ratio of negative to positive sentiment was the exact same as their male counterparts. In fact, the likes of Markievicz actually made some positive speeches. The likes of Markievicz was in favour of opening up the debates and not having private debates. And I should say as well, most women spoke very little. Kathleen Clark spoke 5 times, Margaret Pearse spoke twice, Kathleen O'Callaghan spoke 7 times, and Ada English spoke only 6 times. So you're only really talking about Mary McSweeney and Countess Markievicz. What the whole discussion about the women and their role in that particular Dáil is a reflection of the pretty much sexist and misogynist state that was to evolve. I should just say as well, though, there were more women proportionally in the Irish Parliament than the House of Commons at the time. And if I can make one more point, just to come back to Bill, just in terms of this wider debate, we should remember as well, these TDs weren't gombeans. You know, 60% of the TDs had a secondary school education, which compared to the average population at the time, I think about 1 in 7 of the Irish population at the time had an education. I've gone back and looked at, let's say the debates in the US in the 18th century over the creation of the federal constitution. At the time, the people who created that document, they were talking about social contract theory. They were talking about Plato, Locke, Rousseau, what it means to be a republic. This was the moment, you know, it was the key moment when we would have expected that people would have talked about these important things. I mean, maybe I'm just expecting too much, but there was no mention of Plato. There was no mention of, remember Enda Kenny a couple of years ago talked about signing the contract. No one was talking about this contract that both Peter and Bill have referred to.
The other issue I want to come on to now, and we've had a question in about the vote on the Constitution of October 22nd and what that says. about the second Dáil. And, you know, it's part of this, the background to the debates, you know, the authority of the plenipotentiaries, the authority of the cabinet, its relationship to the parliament and so on. So I'd be really interested in hearing what you've got to say about all of that. And if you like, you know, the authority of the executive that emerges out of all of this.
Who do you want to go first?
Go on ahead, Bill, yeah.
So the authority of the executive that emerges from it, just to go back to what Liam is saying, an interesting difference, I suppose, with the American case is when they decided to appoint a committee to draft the 22 Constitution. It was a non-party committee, so they didn't involve the TDs to the same extent. But I don't really know what the question is getting at, other than to say that under the treaty, the provisional government was established, and basically the Dáil cabinet still continued to exist in tandem with the provisional government. So there was a kind of divided authority structure. But the extent to which this particular provisional government had authority over the country, I mean, we have to remember as well that it's not only the TDs who vote on the treaty, the IRA vote on the treaty at the local level. And the result is as many as 3/4 of the IRA brigades go anti-treaty, controlling 2/3 of the territory of the state. So the authority of the provisional government, such as it was, could only develop very slowly. And also when you talk about the National Army and you talk about the police, these were assembled very rapidly in the context of the Civil War. So you may have had, in terms of governing personnel, people like Griffith, people like William Cosgrave, Kevin O'Higgins, Mulcahy, Collins. These were the people who were the state. They personified what was the state at the time. But all it was a group of people with a limited amount of authority, but nonetheless mandated by the treaty to increase that authority and establish a state. And they remained all the time in constant negotiations with the British throughout the spring of 1922. And the British were very suspicious, actually, of Collins' leanings. And for that reason, although they believed they were showing their good intentions by transferring functions to the provisional government, there was that element of doubt as to which way Collins would go. Would he stick by the treaty, or would he in fact do a deal with De Valera? And really the British only began to relax about this in June with the election, with the 1922 Constitution. And people like Collins, who was Collins, but Churchill in the British cabinet, who was the hawk, essentially, the colonial secretary on the Irish question, then he began to believe that actually Collins would actually deliver on the treaty. So in terms of this idea of governing authority, you've got to realize where they started. They had a civil service from the previous administration, but by and large, the Irish state was assembled, in my view, in the course of the Civil War.
Reva, you're nodding there.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything Bill has said. And, you know, it's worth remembering that, you know, there were a couple of rounds of that constitution. It was, you know, an early version was rejected by the British as being, you know, too Republican and going far beyond the bounds of what the treaty would allow. So, you know, I think that's part of Collins' strategy, as Bill has alluded to. I think his hope is to avoid a decisive split in the army, use the mechanisms, you know, the kind of slightly loose mechanisms of some of the treaty provisions to enact some sort of unity. And then the North comes back into play again once the troubles in the North start attracting significant attention. And it seems like the IRA in the South the divided IRA in the South might be used to attack the North. But there's a curious episode while the negotiations are happening in kind of autumn of 1921, which is, and Bill also alluded to it, as part of this change of title for De Valera from President of the Ministerial Council or whatever it is, President of the Irish Republic. And along with this, there are efforts to kind of restructure what the lines of authority are for the IRA and bring it more firmly under civil control. as opposed to military control. Now, there have been efforts to get every IRA volunteer to swear an oath of allegiance to the Dáil. That's quite haphazard. Their first oath was to the Irish Republic, which, that comes up in the treaty debates as well. I swore an oath to the Republic, not an oath to the Dáil. So there's an attempt to bring the IRA more firmly under civil control, and Mulcahy and Collins withstand it. They push this back. And this is also to do with the poor relationship between Cathal Brugha as Minister for Defence and Mulcahy and Collins as kind of the IRA GHQ leaders. And De Valera is very cross about this. And he says, the army can mutiny if you like, but Ireland will give me another army. And if we kind of piece all this together, my reading of it is that this fits with what I think De Valera's strategy was, which was to allow the negotiations to break down in London, but it would be crucial that they should break down on the question of Ulster and Irish unity and not on the question of the Crown or Empire. And then, a gamble that war wouldn't follow within 3 days, that there be space for another final round of negotiations where he could then come in and push the British a bit farther than the previous delegation had been able to do. And this is why, the delegation were given strong instructions in their last visit to Dublin not to sign the treaty, that they needed to refer it back to the cabinet before they signed anything. And partly why, as Liam said, in the opening sessions of the treaty debates, there's a lot of rancor and a lot of recrimination as to why they exceeded their explicit instructions. So we can see the kind of the rippling effects of all of these complex, overlapping, sometimes conflicting structures, all running out through in the spring of 1922 until finally then it all explodes in June of 1922 when the Civil War finally begins.
And Liam, a question in for you. What does your research show about W.T. Cosgrave's influence on the debates? And also, if you could talk a little bit more about that rivalry between Brugha and Collins and how much that plays in, particularly towards the end of the debates.
Yeah, Cosgrave was actually very quiet for the person who ended up running the state just like 1 year later. But we have to remember as well, and this touches on the previous question you asked, Anya, about executive dominance. Cosgrave was the decisive figure in cabinet, because remember, De Valera believed in both the importance of his institution as president of the Republic and also the dominance of the cabinet. I think I posed this question previously because I wondered, when we have such a dominant executive in the current Irish political system, does it go back to then? Remember, De Valera didn't even want the Dáil to debate the treaty. He wanted the cabinet to reject the treaty. And when we've mentioned a couple of days before the treaty was signed, the document they had discussed then had been rejected by the cabinet. But then when the cabinet discussed this treaty on December 7th and 8th, they met in the Mansion House. I think Lawrence Skinnell was the Lord Mayor. There was a pause. Lawrence Skinnell brought W.T. Cosgrave out to a room. Cosgrave said a prayer, thought about it, and Cosgrave decided, let's actually let the Dáil decide in this document. That really, to be honest, was Cosgrave's main role. I've read somewhere else that Cosgrave actually, surprisingly, for the way in which Cosgrave has been portrayed in Irish politics, he provided moments of light humour in the Dáil debates. He was one of the few people who did so. It's quite striking. There's actually a quite strong divide between, again, the elites and the backbenchers and what they said in the Dáil. The average number of contributions made by the 7 members of the cabinet was 129. For the rest of the Dáil, it was just 12. So again, we're talking about we talk about cabinet dictatorship almost in the current Irish political system. That was very much set in train then early on. But in terms of Cosgrave didn't really say an awful lot. The 3 main speakers were De Valera, Collins and Griffith. De Valera of course, combating Collins and Griffith. I know you asked about the candlemaker, Cathal Brugha, and Collins. Cathal Brugha hasn't been portrayed very well in Irish politics. And yet, at the same time, his legacy goes back to, he was killed just a year later. He was seen as a very heroic individual. He actually called Collins at one stage during the debates his subordinate, because remember, Cathal Brugha was the Minister for Defence. The question, what's quite striking on is the 3 people in cabinet who voted against the treaty, none of them wanted to go to London. De Valera asked Austin Stack and Cathal Brugha, do you want to go to London? And this is one of the accusations Collins would have levelled back at Brugha. Brugha said, I'm a street fighter. But Collins said, I'm a soldier. I know diplomat. So it is quite striking that those three particular individuals didn't attend the talks in London. Brew at one stage did make a very long speech. I think the Irish Times have praised this speech as one of the finest parliamentary speeches ever made, probably in a sarcastic manner. You know, there were certainly a lot of personal animosities, not just between Collins and Brewer, but between other individuals. Griffith and Childers, for me, was the real personal animosity that came to the fore. And remember, Erskine Childers and Arthur Griffith had been part of the team that had negotiated the treaty. At one stage, Erskine Childers is attacking the treaty, and Arthur Griffith says back to him, "I will not be lectured to by any damned Englishman." And Griffith slams his fist on the table, and Erskine Childers stands there and says, "Well, you know, Mr. Griffith, it's a pity you didn't slam the fist down when you were discussing this document with Mr. Lloyd George."
Oh yeah, well, it's nothing if not dramatic. I've been given our 5 minute warning, so I want to, if you like, draw this to a close with final thoughts from all of you. So looking back now, what's your takeaway, or the main points that you would want to, or conclusions? Can we draw conclusions even at this stage? I'm not sure about the treaty debates. Caoimhe, we'll start with you.
I'm interested to hear Liam's stats on how much the cabinet is speaking compared to everybody else, because my initial kind of reaction to that question of, you know, does the treaty debate set a model for executive dominance? That goes against what my impression was. My impression of the debates is that actually here is an occasion where a matter of enormous public import is debated at length, you know, over a long period of time, with a break where constituents, at least some of them, were apparently consulted and listened to. And that this is something that hasn't always been maintained in Irish or indeed British political life. I think we've moved very far away from that now. You know, we have such executive dominance nowadays. But for me, the significance of the treaty is what it tells us about democracy and legitimacy. And I think it raises really uncomfortable questions for where we derive our, where we see the democratic roots of our state, who had the mandate to speak and to vote, on what mandate where were they looking for that mandate. Even if we're going back to the second Dáil elections, those are really problematic as well. And I think, so much of, I guess, the constitutionalist tradition in Irish history and Irish, political thought has sought to draw a line, I suppose, from O'Connellism through to Parnell, through to the Redmond era, and thenceforth into the Free State. But I think that those are very bumpy zigzags, and I think we need to look a bit more closely at those zigs and zags and see the places where notions of democracy are contested or are stretched or are actually ripped up. And I think the treaty shows that to a really illuminating extent.
Liam, when you look at the treaty debates now, and you've looked at them in great detail, conclusions, takeaways?
Well, I suppose the main thing is it's the treaty split Sinn Fein. So the Irish politics has been dominated, as we know, by the rivalry between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the two parties that are inheritors of that split. Ironically, as well, the one party that is going to challenge this dominance, Sinn Fein, also claims an allegiance back to that particular era. So very much, the party politics that we have is very much shaped by that, which also then begs the question of, which I like to do in terms of counterfactuals, what if Labour, remember Labour had stood aside? What if Labour had been in that Dáil, discussing the treaty, raising the issues I've discussed about socio-economic matters? What if Unionists, this was one of the big issues in relation that really wasn't discussed. Southern Unionists were about 9% of the population. We know that Southern Unionist population declined pretty quickly in the couple of decades after this stage. What about farmers and so on? What if we had, because as I mentioned, at the election just 6 months later, 40% of people voted for parties and independents other than the two kind of Sinn Féin blocks. What if they had been discussing the treaty? On the other hand, I always wonder, what if Sinn Féin hadn't split? What if they had followed the public? What kind of state would Ireland have had You know, Mexico, for example, Anya, was dominated for most of the 20th century by one party, the party of the institutionalized revolution. And that, you know, one party in power leads to corruption. You know, South Africa has been dominated by the ANC. It's arguable if Sinn Fein hadn't split over the treaty, maybe Ireland would have ended up in a worse situation, because you need to have a genuine government versus opposition. Now, of course, these are all hypothetical questions. What it does say, though, is that the very fact it took until May 2020 for the two inheritors of the treaty split to come into government really shows how important and the legacy that the treaty still has in Irish politics. And even if we follow what's going on in relation to Article 16 and the North, very much talking about the same issues that were being discussed in London 100 years ago.
So, Bill, the final word to you. Is the wheel coming full circle with all of these issues all over again?
Well, I think Liam is right to say that the legacy of this in party politics has been very profound, and there is a paradox here, because we cannot explain why people voted one way or another on the treaty in terms of socioeconomic categories, but nonetheless the legacy has been so profound in terms of structuring and to some extent freezing the Irish political system. And then we've got the entry of Sinn Fein, which of course, if you think of the electoral contest that took place in 1927, you had Fianna Fáil, you had Cumann na nGaedheal, and you had Sinn Fein. And here we are 100 years later with these three parties. And here we are potentially, as a country, as a state, as a society, facing a period in our history which once again partition will become the ultimate issue in terms of public debate. So I think the legacy has been quite profound in that sense. And I also agree with Caoimhe about the complicated nature of democracy and sovereignty and self-determination and so forth. But I just want to say one thing in terms of what my answer would have been to your first question, which is to say, you know, De Valera was interviewed by T. Desmond Williams, who was a UCD historian, about the Civil War after the Second World War. And he went to De Valera, he submitted to De Valera's secretaries loads of questions about the treaty and the fallout from the treaty. And he must have asked him about 25 different questions. And the impression I got is that even though I had read the exchange, this whole period is so complicated and so convoluted. The way in which the treaty negotiations get debated then in the Dáil, and then ultimately you have an election in June 16, then you have the Civil War. It is the most complicated period of contemporary Irish history, in my opinion. And I spent a long time studying it, and really, I myself am quite confused about these colliding authority structures, the different strategies, the different arguments, the different realities in the different parts of Ireland in terms of what was going on the ground. So it's incredibly complicated for a historian.
Well, it's been incredibly interesting listening to the three of you talking about the treaty debates over the past hour. I've gone a little bit over time, but honest to goodness, I've really enjoyed it. So thank you all. And thank you to everyone who sent in questions. I tried to get to as many as I could, but unfortunately, look, we could keep going at this for another hour, but I'm handing you over now to Jennifer, and she'll lead you to the next session now with David McCullough, which I'm sure will be just as interesting. So thank you all for now.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Indeed. Thank you very much to everyone. That was really lively. And as somebody who always likes to use both qualitative and quantitative methods, I was really, really intrigued by that analysis. So thank you so much. We are going to move very swiftly on to our third session, which looks at the aftermath of the treaty, which we have been hearing all about. And I'm going to hand over now to the chair, Dr. David McCullough from RTE. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everybody. We have had two really excellent discussions so far. So Anya put the pressure on our three panelists there by putting it up to us, but I'm sure they will be well able for the challenge ahead. So we've heard about the negotiation of the treaty, we've heard about the debate on the treaty, and we're now going to look at the consequences of the treaty, the aftermath of the treaty. And we have an excellent panel. I hope they're joining in. Yes, I can see our first panelist is Dr. Anne Dolan. Anne is the Associate Professor in Modern Irish History at TCD. Her work concentrates on the nature and the legacy of the Irish Civil War. And among her books, commemorating the Irish Civil War, an edited collection, No Surrender Here, the Civil War Papers of Ernie O'Malley. And most recently, with Will Murphy, she wrote Michael Collins' The Man and the Revolution. We're also joined by Dr. Ciara Meehan, who is reader in history at the University of Hertfordshire. And among her books are The Cosgrave Party, which is a history of Cumberland. And most recently, I think, along with Stephen Collins, she wrote Saving the State, a history of Fine Gael. And we're also joined by Professor Ian McBride, who is Foster Professor of Irish History at Hertford College at the University of Oxford. And he has far too many publications for me to list, but I'll just mention two of them. 18th Century Ireland, The Isle of Slaves, really excellent history in the Gill series. And he was co-editor of the Princeton History of Modern Ireland. So we have three experts and me, and we will have a discussion of the aftermath of the treaty debates. And I suppose, first of all, to start maybe with a general question to all of you, in terms of the consequences of the treaty and the treaty debates, you have two concrete consequences. One is the establishment of an independent Irish state, which formally comes into existence, of course, in December 1922. And the other is the Civil War. And that, is two very contrasting consequences of this. It's kind of a dual legacy. It's a tricky legacy to deal with. And maybe I'd ask you to start off. I mean, what do you make of that legacy?
I don't know. I mean, I'm never sure. It's a bit like Bill at the end of the last session. I get increasingly confused the more I think about it. But I think it's really hard. I always find this when I'm trying to teach about the treaty in this period. It's really hard to get back into those days after they come back from London with this piece of paper. In a way, we are so inclined to just think one thing leads to the next, leads to the next. We can't. It's so hard to think about the period without reading it back through that lens of the Civil War. And just thinking about, in many respects, how confused people were at that moment. They have to decide for the first time, what do they mean by all those big words like independence and freedom? And there's such a lot of those divisions just coming to the surface for people who have been part of a movement that has been, in a way, purposely vague about what it meant and what it intended by those concepts. And that this period, in a way, has been completely overshadowed really by what follows it, and unfairly so. And I think we don't really get to grips with the complexity of it. And as you say, this sort of dual contradictory outcome is then very, very hard to deal with, because in a way it becomes very obvious that this is about a cohort of people who go pro-treaty having to make that decision. How far are they prepared to go to protect what they've got? And I always think it's quite striking. There's a piece that I think John Regan quotes it from Desmond Fitzgerald, where he's writing to a friend after the execution of Childers, and he has to effectively say, for you, Childers was a very particular person. He was one thing, he was the other. For us, this was about, the survival of the state itself. And, I think that the degree to which that feeling becomes ingrained very, very quickly for people who just a few weeks and months before were talking about voting for a document, the speed, it's dragged out over several weeks and months, but the hardening of opinion changes maybe the nature of independence or the type of independence that it's going to be. But then equally, we have to live with the consequences just mentioned in the last session in terms of the long-term legacy of the Civil War as well.
And Ciara, maybe you might add to that. I mean, it was a difficult inheritance for the pro-treaty side as they entered on the task of building up new institutions, a new state.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an extremely messy period. We talk about the pro-treaty side and the anti-treaty side, but we're not actually talking about political parties. Sinn Fein splits, and out of that you then have the creation of a government run by the pro-treaty side, who at the same time are trying to create a political party that will function as the government party as well. And that's such an unusual situation. Most political parties are created to win power democratically, and yet Fine Gael, as they find themselves already in power. So it's not as straightforward, as Anne said. It's not one thing following on directly from the other. It's this really messy period in which you're looking at trying to build a new state in the midst of a civil war while trying to create a party political system too. The challenges were huge.
And Ian, this whole morning's discussion is about remembering the treaty debates, remembering the treaty, trying to get a handle on what it all meant. But because it has these two outcomes, independence on one hand, civil war on the other, it's very difficult to get a grasp on, isn't it?
Yeah, it's even more complicated, isn't it? Because the treaty sets 26 counties on the path to independence and civil war. but it leaves 6 counties outside the Free State, as we've heard in earlier sessions this morning. And my understanding, insofar as I've got one, is very much focused on the 6 counties and on partition. I think that the prioritization of independence, which has been talked about, and the Civil War led to a turning inwards of energies in the south, which gave the Northern Parliament a little bit of breathing space to consolidate its administration. And this is the point where it becomes difficult to write the history of Ireland in a single narrative frame. When you've got 2 administrative centres in Belfast and Dublin, and you have institutions being founded, you begin to get 2 separate histories. But the point I want to make is we shouldn't retrospectively disentangle North and South quite this early on. Now, we heard Ulster didn't really figure in the treaty debates very much, but it did figure in the treaty, as everybody knows, but I don't think it's really been mentioned so far. There are 18 articles altogether. The first 10 deal with Ireland as a whole, and then you have the 5 Ulster clauses, which set up the Boundary Commission, discuss the powers of the Belfast Parliament, but also deal with things like the Council of Ireland, the financial situation in Belfast, safeguards for the minority, and so on. The point I'd really like to make is there's still a lot up for grabs in the aftermath of the treaty. We might think that partition is a done deal, but the financial situation of the Belfast Parliament isn't, proportional representation isn't, the Council of Ireland isn't, and above all, the fundamental size and shape of the unit isn't, because everyone still expects the Boundary Commission to make some kind of significant change.
And is that why, Ian, is that why, to an extent, the border doesn't really figure in the treaty debates, because everybody on either side assumes that the Boundary Commission is going to solve their problem?
Right. I mean, there are two reasons. I suppose, first of all, one of the reasons that Ulster isn't talked about very much in the treaty itself is, of course, that these are not all-party negotiations or all-party talks, to use a phrase from the 1990s. Craig refused to be involved and negotiates from the outside. He refused to be involved unless he was guaranteed there would be no all-Ireland dimension. And the other thing, as you suggest, is the device of the Boundary Commission enables everybody to sidestep that issue for the moment. So it's not as if Ulster isn't on people's minds. It's just deferred until the Boundary Commission, which people expect will be called quite soon after the treaty.
Right. And Ciara, the fact that the Civil War breaks out and that the new government's attention is diverted, and there's a delay in setting up the Boundary Commission, I mean, does that make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, the government is so concerned with trying to embed democracy and to get the state up and running that everything else sort of gets pushed to the sides or attention gets distracted, even aside from the Boundary Commission. If you look at membership of the League of Nations, which is a key priority for the government to establish international recognition of sovereignty, they keep coming back to this point until the Civil War is under control, until the new state is functioning properly. Everything else has to take a back seat effectively. So the North again gets deprioritized in that respect because it's just completely focused on the Free State itself.
Okay, Anne, could we go back a little bit to the chronology, because we've heard about the treaty debates and they end on the 7th of January 1922 with that vote, narrow enough, in favour of supporting the treaty. De Valera resigns, Griffith takes over as president of the Dáil. What happens then?
I mean, there's so many different things happening at the same time. I mean, just even thinking back to what Bill said a minute ago, there's those discussions going on between Collins and London, there's the constitution being put together, there's the new provisional government. I'm getting them all in the wrong order, they're all happening at the same time. The Dáil, I think we sometimes forget, and I think it would be lovely if someone did a small study on those Dáil debates that happen after January, after the vote has happened, after De Valera is no longer president. There's still those discussions in the Dáil with members from both sides of the treaty split happening across February into May. There's a fascinating study to be done there. So there's that, but I think on a local level, you've got people trying to make up their minds. You've got the IRA splitting, as Bill mentioned earlier. There's also the sense in which there's having to, manage recruitment to what might be a new, if you like, national army. You've got, really interesting letters coming from even during the treaty debates. If you look at a letter by someone like Bat O'Connor, who writes home to his sister, and he's talking about the way in which the IRA are moving in one direction over another. You've got this personal kind of dilemma for some of these members of the IRA. There's a fascinating letter from one man called Joseph Dunn in the National Library. He talks about the reasons he's going to go pro-treaty, and he says, I don't believe in that this crowd in Beggar's Bush have a hope. I'm a Republican at heart. My father's just died and I need a job, and it's as simple as that. And I think sometimes we need to think about just that personal type of decision making that's happening in those weeks and months. But obviously the IRA are really splitting. They're coming to a head. February 22, for example, you can see there's a sort of a coming head-to-head in Limerick where there's Great British Pathy newsreel footage of it, but you start to see these kind of clashes as different barracks and things are being taken over in different parts of the country. Richard Mulcahy then threatens to dismiss any officer who dares to attend what's going to be an hoped-for army convention. You've got a whole variety of meetings between various different figures within the IRA trying to sort of bring things together, but at the same time there's these instincts that are pulling them apart. You get the presses of the Freeman's Journal destroyed because they publish what's felt by the anti-treatyites to be a misleading article about meetings of the IRA. You've got a seizure of arms and explosives by the 1st Southern Division of at the Upnor vessel in Cork. This is, if you like, a boat leaving with British supplies. By April, you have a Republican Army Council setting up military headquarters in Dublin. You have the seizure of the forecourt. You have all these sort of moves to try and keep them together, but equally things that are happening that are just pulling them apart. And I think it just takes those instincts just can't be kept in tune anymore. They can't be kept in train. Never mind what's happening in terms of the Collins de Valera Pact. You've all sorts of efforts to keep things together as long as possible. And it's just incredibly difficult.
It is. I'm
to describe it. Sorry,
I'm exhausted after hearing all of that. But it's very complex and there's a lot of moving parts. But Ciara, the provisional government is established with Collins at its head, but the Dáil cabinet still exists with Griffith at its head, and some ministers are members of both. So that's an added layer of complication. But there's also is there a difference in approach perhaps between Griffith and Collins, whereas Collins is really keen to maintain unity, and you can see that in the De Valera Collins Pact, whereas Griffith is more, seems to me, is more interested in establishing authority. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely a contrast between Griffith and Collins's approach, but I'm going to be really cheeky and ask, can I pass this back to Anne, because I think Anne is more of an expert with her recent biography.
Sure, yeah.
Thanks, Ciara. I'll throw one back at you in a minute. I mean, I think it's quite striking that after the fall of the forecourts, Collins kind of comes out with things, we don't want to steamroller them. That idea of still maybe potentially holding a hand out. And, before Collins dies, the anti-treatyites really don't have a strong foothold in any kind of city or major town anymore. So there's, that's a really notable difference between maybe his approach at that stage, between July into August. Griffith is quite striking. He does an interview shortly before he dies, and it's quite striking the degree to which he is very clear about this is a war that needs to be fought, needs to be finished, it needs to be finished quickly, and much more uncompromising in his position in terms of how he sees the war going to be pursued. I mean, Bill, Kazan is written extensively on this. Those who follow in the wake of both Griffith and Collins, it's quite striking. Some of the British reports after the death of Collins reflect concerns that really what's needed is a strong military figure who's going to finish this war off quickly. And they're slightly concerned about what they see as the slightly more civilian politicians taking over. But I think Bill makes the argument superbly in his book, this idea that those civilian politicians then went on to pursue that the war quite vigorously, and much more vigorously, certainly, than those early British reports expected, particularly when you think about the executions and those policies.
You must come in there.
Yeah, just to say, Anne mentioned earlier the Craig Collins Pacts, and maybe we'll come back to those, but remember that the assumption still is that the Boundary Commission is going to work during this particular period, and it's actually supported by statements made in London. So Lloyd George's public position on the Boundary Commission was you can't coerce Ulster. This had long been a British principle, but you can persuade it. It could be persuaded into the Free State as a result of financial pressures. He also made it clear that there were majorities for the Free State into Ulster counties, Fermanagh and Tyrone. I mean, majorities of 55% is the usual figure. They shouldn't be coerced either. And he also made it clear that the qualification clause in the Boundary Commission, that is, you pay attention to the wishes of the inhabitants insofar as they're compatible with economic and geographic conditions, that was restricted to isolated enclaves like the Glens of Antrim. So again, at this period, the music coming from London still sounds quite positive as far as the North is concerned.
Now, London also had a role, of course, in supporting the pro-treaty side and the provisional government, and that particularly through the agency of Winston Churchill, who was Secretary of State for the colonies. Ian, can you tell us a little bit about Churchill's role there?
Well, the most one obvious aspect of that support was the field guns given to the pro-treaty forces. I mean, it seems to me that that's not the decisive factor, and that the points that have been made in earlier sessions underline the fact that the Catholic Church was also on the treaty side. The banks and businesses were on the treaty side. The media was on the treaty side. Public opinion, insofar as it had been measured in elections, was on the treaty side. I don't think that's really the decisive factor, but I don't know whether my panelists will disagree with that.
Well, I'll throw that over to Anne, because certainly Republicans would, and some still do, argue that the British influence was decisive. And I mean, obviously, as Ian says, the field guns are the most obvious sign of that, but there was support, other support as well.
I mean, there's a whole element, having listened to some of the panels earlier, there's an element of do you interpret some of it as support or pressure? I mean, some of it was pressure in terms of, you know, the version of the Constitution goes over, pressure comes, they have to change it, you know, so you've a variety of different issues. Some of the correspondence back and forth, say, between Collins and Churchill are very revealing in terms of, say, like Collins writes to him saying, you have to do something about what's going on in Northern Ireland. Churchill very easily writes back and says, well, you know, what are you doing about those murders down in Dunmanway and Bandon? You know, so there's a really interesting dialogue going on. At the same time, you know, you are getting provision of arms, you get provision of intelligence, you know, the British are stopping arms getting over to the anti-treatyites. You see later on, the provisional government are asking, well, can we use St. Helena? We're running out of room for prisoners because there's so many being taken in. So you have these really interesting little connections back and forth, but maybe, I don't know, maybe the really interesting aspect is the degree to which that perception of support, or even things like O'Higgins saying in the treaty debates, if we're going to, you know, go into the empire, we're going in with our heads up. There's that propaganda value of there being British support for the Free State position, and even things like referring to the National Army as green and tans and things like that. You know, the degree to which it was so easily mobilised as by the anti-treatyites in terms of the propaganda, not just at the time, but maybe more so even in the decades afterwards.
Kira, you want to get in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, there's a really interesting collection of correspondence in the National Archives after the death of Griffith and Collins, when the British government are writing to kind of offer their sympathy, but also to find out, you know, what exactly is happening now in terms of honouring the treaty and the agreement there. And you get responses from the Irish side saying, of course, we'll, you know, Griffith and Collins are gone, but we stand by everything they stood for, and we'll continue to honour the spirit of the treaty and implement all of the elements of it. And I think it's a really interesting insight as well into the psychology of those who, at least on paper or from a propaganda side, who had to pick up the mantle of Griffith and Collins in the first decade of independence afterwards, and shows the extent to which the treaty, the negotiations and the debates shaped the way they approached building and governing the new state in that first decade.
Well, staying with that thought, Ciara, one of the things that's happening in this period immediately after the treaty debates is the new constitution, the Constitution of the Irish Free State in 1922. How important is that? Because I mean, obviously, Collins was trying to write a constitution which would embrace the Republican ideal and you know, repair the split, which wasn't acceptable to the British.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the new constitution obviously is a challenge because it's got to be shaped by the treaty, and yet, you know, going back to what we've been saying about this sort of messy circumstances where you're trying to accommodate Republican ideals and try and heal some of those rifts. But there's always going to be elements of the constitution that aren't going to satisfy those interests. So the role of the Governor General, for example, although very much a figurehead, doesn't exercise the responsibilities afforded to him, is always going to be controversial. But there's also really interesting articles in that constitution too that sort of break with the British tradition and sort of create distance, I guess, between the Irish model and the British one. And I think Articles 65 and 66, which are the ones that give the High Court's judicial review of legislation, is a really fascinating element because that's the protection effectively of civil rights. And although the High Court ultimately ends up being reluctant to exercise scrutiny where there's some more draconian legislation coming from the Free State, elements like that, I think, are quite interesting aspects of the Constitution that get overlooked perhaps in favour of talking about parts like the Governor General. So you can see these attempts to try and satisfy different elements, but of course it's also really hard to satisfy two sides that are very clearly poles apart.
And Ian, the Irish Free State Constitution, I mean, I suppose we should really look at it in the context that there were lots of new states appearing on the continent of Europe, lots of new constitutions being written. The Weimar Constitution, of course, is one example. How would you assess the Free State Constitution in that context?
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, because the makers of the Free State Constitution were very aware of that comparative angle. So I recently came across a book published by Doyle Aaron at this time called Select Constitutions of the World. And it's passed around the capitals of Europe. It's a diplomatic exercise, you know, it's an attempt to win over international opinion for the Irish Free State. And it contains 19 constitutions translated with introductions. It's quite a sophisticated work. The 19 begin with the Irish Free State and go backwards in time to the United States of America. You know, good choice of an end point, I suppose, a starting point. And they go through the new European constitutions, Poland, Yugoslavia, but also, of course, as you would expect, Australia, Canada, and the Dominions. But one of the things that really strikes me about that is that among the other new European constitutions, there are elements that feature later in De Valera's 1937 constitution that don't appear in 1922. So first of all, there's a lot more of God in, for example, the Polish constitution. You know, it begins with a religious framework, as 1937 does, and also a lot more about the nation. So one of the interesting things about 1922 is it locates the source of political authority in the people of Ireland, not the nation, not that more abstract cultural identity, if you like.
Okay, and obviously, as we were saying, Collins was trying to ride two horses, write a constitution that would keep De Valera et al. On board while still slipping it past the scrutiny of the cabinet in London. And the fact that the cabinet in London had a say in this, you know, how independent was the Irish Free State?
Yeah, I mean, people have talked about it in that light, and I think you can see it in terms of, you know, very clearly in that point about the oath and the change that has to be made in terms of how it's included. You can see it in the context. People have argued that this was important in terms of getting that Article 8 in about freedom of conscience. The fact that, you know, the treaty itself is embedded in the way in which it's printed and as you read it now as a document. I mean, I'm struck by other aspects of it that maybe get overlooked as well, though. The degree to which, Article 79, I think, is really striking, and it's not one that gets looked at. It's this idea of the transfer. It's about the transfer of administration in the context of public service, and just in a way, it embeds, if you like, the continuity, and there is that huge continuity of individuals within the civil service from pre-independence to post-independence. Over 80% of them stay in their posts largely, and if you like, this is key in terms of just keeping the apparatus of the place together and intact, and there is something to work with. But equally, I mean, you're getting things like all citizens have the right to free elementary education. You've got, really interesting things being embedded in there. And yes, you can argue, is that ambition pretty limited, or was that actually quite a realistic one at the time? I mean, I think we've overlooked a whole variety of aspects of it. I think one of the other things we maybe need to think about a little bit are those sequence of articles from sort of 6, 7, 8, 9, that protected people's rights in terms of the liberty of the person, the liberty of your dwelling, all of those things, the rights to, freely assemble, express opinions, join a union. The speed with which they're sort of overrided by special powers in the context of the Civil War. And I think, again, that the pressures coming, whether from London or elsewhere, that those pressures are very quickly interfering with the rights that in theory are being enshrined in this constitution at the same time.
Maybe saying with you, Anne, we heard in the last session about the treaty debates and the ideas that were expressed there. I mean, are those ideas still current? Are they still playing a role in the debates about the Constitution and about the future of the state at this stage?
I mean, I think in some ways they are. In other ways, I'm always surprised when you look at the material, when you look at the, particularly things like the newspapers, when you look at sort of more day-to-day correspondence from the period, the degree to which bread and butter politics starts to take over, and very, very quickly it starts to take over. I think, Liam referred to it earlier in the context of that election results in June 22, with that 40% vote, 17 Labour TDs, 7, Farmers' Party, there's a businessman's party in there, 9 independents. So yeah, there's these things are there. I mean, the freedom to achieve freedom line, I think, is the one that's usually interpreted in the context of expanding sovereignty, and for decades people have looked at that in the context of those, the dismantling of the treaty, joining the League of Nations, the imperial conferences. I always think of it in terms of, it begs the question about other possible definitions of freedom that maybe people brought into the period. Clearly for a lot of people it was the notion of independence, and freedom is going to be about having more land, and for many of them that doesn't come together. It's certainly, freedom was, I doubt if many people defined freedom the freedom to achieve freedom about being a cut in the old age pension. But in a way, that tells you about the costs of your independence. You're going to have to pay for this stuff now. And just the sudden realization of the cost of things like the old age pension bill, the realities of an independent state really do kick in. And what does freedom mean in those kind of bread and butter terms? I suppose if you think of it in the longer term, we got the freedom to choose the governments we wanted in the longer term. And often we got the freedom not to change things. So I don't know, some of those other things, Collins's view that, the agreeing to negotiate was the compromise, that's a part of the debate that doesn't get referred to as much, I think. I don't know. But yeah, I think the freedom to achieve freedom one is that long-term one for me.
Ian, the costs of freedom, an interesting concept for somebody living in Brexit Britain.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you want to get me onto the subject of Brexit, although it does raise the tyranny of the majority in a different context, the tyranny of a narrow majority. I mean, I suppose one of the things that occurs to me about the continuing power of ideas is the way in which they facilitate division and eventually conflict because of the way that Irish nationality is defined. So when De Valera makes the case for Irish independence in his campaign in the United States, the first point he makes is this, that the people of Ireland constitute a distinct and separate nation, ethnically, historically, and tested by every standard of political science, and therefore they're entitled to self-determination. And it's very difficult to row back from that kind of language, I mean, at least in a short space of time. And one of the things that strikes me about the treaty debates is so much of the case for Irish independence was historical, and it was premised on the fact that in every generation, the Irish had resisted English rule or British rule. and they'd never consented to it. And one of the problems with the treaty was this was apparently the first time the Irish themselves had put on the chains, as it were, that they'd agreed to their own subordination. So there's a disruptive way in which the power of ideas continues.
Okay, I'm going to ask what to me seems a rather difficult question to answer, and I'm going to ask it to Ciara first. So sorry about that, Ciara. The question is this: I mean, is civil war, or some form of civil war, is it inevitable?
Crikey. Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot with this one, David. Yes, I'm going to put my neck on the line and say I think it probably was inevitable from the moment that the treaty is signed, but it has its roots in the lead up to it. So we've heard in the earlier sessions how there was this kind of period where Griffith was trying to clarify with De Valera what they wanted out of the negotiations, or what they could expect to get out of the treaty negotiations and so on. So there's all this confusion, if you want to call it that, before they even go into the negotiations, and misunderstandings and kind of aspirations about whether a republic is achievable or not. So all of these expectations are heightened. But from the moment that the treaty is signed, and obviously there is this threat of great, and swift war happening, I think the road is set to civil war almost thereafter. I mean, I often wonder if the delegates had come out and said we're being threatened with civil war and held some, or threatened with war and held some sort of press conference, whether that may have, I don't know, it's one of the big what if questions, whether that would have had an impact in that moment. But I think from the moment the treaty is signed, and because there was all of this confusion or miscommunication in the lead up to it, that what came afterwards was almost inevitable. I don't know. What do my other panel think?
Well, I'll bring Anne in there, because I mean, the threat or the possibility of civil war, it's not that explicit, but it is certainly mentioned, I think, during the treaty debates, and it is certainly, I think everybody appears to have been aware that this is a potential outcome if things go badly wrong, and obviously that's what drives the efforts to avoid or to heal the split. Was it inevitable, do you think?
I mean, it's hard to, in some ways, it's hard to sort of claim that it, in some shape of violence, wasn't going to be inevitable, in the sense that, if you look at, as you say, Collins in the debate stands up and says, if you vote against this, your policy is war. And war to the finish, and that's that's very clear what he feels that is going to look like. I mean, I think it's quite striking when you look at those weeks after the treaty vote has been taken, the degree to which De Valera is losing his authority amongst the many of them. And you could argue, did he really have very much? But very clearly, he's been pushed to one side by those people who are inside the forecourts. He's not really been listened to. I remember coming across a letter at one point in the O'Malley stuff where they're pretty much saying, well, here's our policy, go and tell De Valera. And it's that sense of it, he's not being consulted. And, really the degree to which there's instincts that play that I think we still need to grapple a little bit more with. I mean, I was struck by a letter in O'Malley's papers from August 21, that anxiety to get back to something that looked like the more ordered shape of things that existed pre-truce, if you like, that the men were having too much fun, some of them were going off and getting married and things like this, and can we not just get back to fighting? When you look at some ordinary members of the IRA expressing instincts like, well, what do we do now? Do I go back to being a nobody behind the plough? That there's, I think that it's quite, we have to think about that idea of how, if you like, you've mobilized people to get you to a very particular position. How do you demobilize some of them? And that's a problem that works itself out, obviously, then in 24 as well, to some degree, or maybe doesn't work itself out. It's an issue that's faced by De Valera after the election 32. What do you do with those who helped you get into power? Whether it's inevitable, I think it's one of those kind of, it's almost a what if question, but not quite. But there's that instinct, even thinking about Tom Barry's idea, let's go and that last ditch attempt he puts forward, let's go and fight the British again and start back to kind of continue the War of Independence. There's just these instincts to pull and push, and they just cannot. They can't make it work.
Ian, if is the only way that they could have avoided civil war to have resumed the war with the British, or perhaps to have had a wider and much more devastating civil war north-south?
Well, Well, I thought you were going to thought you were going to ask whether they could fight the Ulster Unionists instead, which was the prospect that Lloyd George put to them at various points. I mean, I love this question, and you could spend a whole session on picking it. It seems to me, and I suppose this is what Anne is saying, that the potential for some kind of conflict is very, very strong. And the reasons for that is that you've got local IRA units who are now in control of parts of the country and have to be replaced by a centralized state-backed army. And so the chances of them all agreeing to give up the control that they've got are pretty slim, given the divisions that there are. But then one key fact, which is a bit more slippery, I think, is the position of De Valera. So how do you turn disagreements within the IRA into a civil war? For that, I think you need a political leader, or at least someone you can point to as representing the anti-treaty case. And that's less predictable, I think, because De Valera in many ways is interested in a different kind of compromise. It's not an absolutist position. So
okay.
There's room for more possibilities there, I think.
A couple of questions from the audience that I'll try and get through. One for Ciara from Seamus McSwivna. Through your research on Cosgrave and his party, did you find that, sorry, somebody's done something and now I can't read it. Did you find that he was more a follower of Griffith rather than De Valera and Collins?
In what sense? Is there any further context?
No, that's all he says, I'm afraid. Okay. Well, I suppose in the economic sense, in the economic sense, I suppose, in fact, Fianna Fáil ended up following a Griffithite policy after 1932 in terms of free trade and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Cosgrave, he didn't really have the luxury necessarily of thinking of one political ideology over the other, because as Anne said earlier, he was faced with the bread and butter politics of day-to-day administration. And it's quite interesting that the Cumann Gael government did, to an extent, follow protectionist policies, but also had members within the party and the cabinet itself who were in favour of free trade policies. So they sort of oscillated back and forth between that. And as you said, David, it's Fianna Fáil who ultimately end up following Griffith's protectionist policies. So I think for Cosgrave, it was more a case of dealing with the challenges as they presented themselves while he was administering the government of the country, rather than necessarily actively pursuing policies that Griffith had outlined in the Resurrection of Hungary, for example, or his other policies.
Sure. Now, a question from Colm Kenny. To what extent do you think the history of the treaty period was subsequently shaped by De Valera? Who wants to take that one on? I'll throw it at you.
Thank you. I mean, I suppose you can, if you look at it the other way, I mean, on the one hand, there's some really interesting correspondence coming out from De Valera, even when he was in prison, about, Dorothy McArdle, get Dorothy to start writing about certain things. You get the Tragedies of Kerry little pamphlet written in 24. So, you can see that maybe the early shots are coming from that direction. But then you get Pierce Beasley's great big 2-volume biography of Collins in 26, I think, which initially was commissioned by the government. You get, in a way, if you like, there's war by other means in a whole variety of different books. I mean, Beasley brings out a version of that book again when it looks like Frank Pakenham is going to, publish Peace by Ordeal. He's also very annoyed by Frank O'Connor's biography of Collins. But arguably, in the long term, do the anti-treaty side win the propaganda war? Perhaps, in the sense that I think you very clearly see them slip into pro-treaty versus Republican. In the use of that kind of language, there's a sense in which very quickly there's a sense that those who go pro-treaty are no longer Republican, or no longer have Republican instincts. And I think in a way, maybe that's one of the places where there's a key sort of propaganda victory, if you like, for the anti-treaty side very quickly. I suppose you have to remember, though, the degree to which censorship played a huge role in terms of stopping the anti-treaty voice through the period. And getting that voice heard became very notable in terms of the origins of the Nation newspaper first, and then the Irish Press, obviously. That was a very meandering and poor answer to a question.
Excellent answer as ever. Ciara, you wanted to get back in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in for a second on that, and I wouldn't call this a propaganda victory because it's kind of a great. It's one of the things that isn't particularly well known, but that commemoration that's on Leinster Lawn, which connects Griffith, Collins, and Kevin O'Higgins as well, and that was installed by the Free State government to connect O'Higgins not just to the Civil War, but also to Griffith and Collins's legacy. You know, although De Valera's propaganda war is quite victorious and extensive, the pro-treaty side in Cumann na Gael aren't above those sort of efforts as well, and that was a very deliberate attempt, which of course under Fianna Fáil parts of that was disestablished as well, and then re-established. But I think that in itself is a really interesting moment in terms of the government and Cumann na Gael participating in those propaganda efforts.
Even this was the Pádraig Cullen biography of Griffiths later on. There Cosgrave's involved in the committee sort of overseeing that. Yeah.
And Neil Jordan has a lot to answer for as well. There's a couple of questions from Des Gunning, and I'll put one of them to you, Ian, maybe. Wasn't partition a fact of life since as far back as 1886? That might be going a bit far back, but even if you look at the universities, I mean, Queen's becomes an independent university in 1908, while Galway, Dublin and Cork become the National University of Ireland. So clearly, at least as far back as then, partition was a fact of life.
I don't think so. I mean, I think what was a fact of life was that the North had a very distinctive character, politically, religiously, culturally. And as many people recognized, it was set apart from the rest of the island. That didn't mean that anybody thought it should have its own distinctive political institutions. And above all, it didn't mean that anybody could agree on what the North was. I mean, what its territorial extent was. So I think there's an important point being made there. And that is that partition doesn't come out of nowhere. I mean, if you read what De Valera says about Ulster, a constant message in De Valera speeches and in other Sinn Fein speeches is that divisions in the North are artificially generated and sustained by British imperialists for their own purposes. So it's important not to accept that. There are deep religious and cultural differences in the North, but it's not until quite late on that Ulster Unionists begin to think those divisions should be translated into institutions, political institutions.
And I suppose there's no reason why the political institution couldn't have been subordinate to a Dáil rather than subordinate to the House of Commons. There's a question again as well from Noel Dorr. Would anyone like to comment on why the group in the Four Courts, especially Ernie O'Malley, were so callous and uncaring about the historic documents which were used as barricades and destroyed in the attack? Better direct that at you, Anne.
Thank you. I mean, there's been, I suppose, debate back and forth as to who's to blame in the sense that, you know, some inside the Four Courts blame those who sent the bombardment in, those outside blamed, well, why did you store, you know, weapons and ammunition and various things in the various different parts of the Four Courts? If you look at some of O'Malley's notebooks, some of the interviews he would have done later in life, when you hear some of the people inside the Four Courts talking about just their time in there, and even the way they were using some of the kind of ledgers and books and just blocking up the windows with them, and, you know, putting on wigs and doing, you know, various things. It's quite striking, just the on the one hand, the atmosphere in there. There's a really interesting interview that Claire Sheridan, who's a cousin of Churchill, she got inside the Four Courts before the 30th of June or the 28th of June, and did an interview, I think, with Rory O'Connor in there, and just her description of these young men going around the Four Courts is really, really fascinating. But yeah, it's a huge issue, and obviously the Trinity Project Beyond 2022 is trying to piece it all back together again. And I think some of the stuff that they've been finding are those attempts at the time to sort of say, well, could you pass out some of the records? Could we protect some of the stuff in there? That worry was clearly there. There was a knowledge of what was potentially at stake. I mean, how we read this in the context of, you know, some have read it, I think this is about, if you like, destroying the records of the old regime, if you like. I don't know if we could read it as symbolically as that. I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear what others think of it, because it's a you know, it's a very, very tricky one to pin down, particularly, as I said, when there's that sense of, well, you know, you didn't have to blow it up, you didn't have to store your weapons in there. You're never going to get agreement on who's going to take responsibility for that.
Sure. Can I ask, Ian, we talked a little bit about the context in terms of the Constitution, the European context, but there's a wider imperial context to all of this in terms of the British Empire, or the British Commonwealth of Nations, as it was described for the first time, I think, in the actual treaty. So imperialism, self-determination are at the root of the problems with the treaty negotiations. And how does that play out in the wider British Commonwealth?
Well, I think self-determination and imperialism, both very interesting. If I take maybe imperialism first of all, I think the British were, the British participants in the treaty and the aftermath of the treaty were all to some extent imperialists. I don't think there's any doubt about that. You could want to reform the empire and still be an imperialist. But when we talk about the impact of imperialism, we tend to mean something a bit more than that. We mean that political positions were underpinned, or a view of the world was underpinned by ideas of racial inferiority. The sense that there was a civilizing mission that Europeans shared, and that involved raising other peoples, non-white peoples on the planet, to the point where they would be capable of self-government, a point that the Europeans themselves would judge. And I think that doesn't figure very largely in the story that we're talking about today. I don't think that's a major determinant of what happens in Ireland, although you can, of course, find statements by also Unionists and British politicians that have elements of supremacism in them. So, I mean, when people at the time looked for comparisons to what was going on in Ireland, they were generally European comparisons, and they're not really dependent on imperialism in the sense that I've been defining it. An example of that is the Handbook of the Ulster Question, which Kevin O'Sheil puts together, and it is the official line in the preparations for the Boundary Commission. And in there, O'Sheil says Ireland isn't a unique situation, and then he looks at others and he finds Upper Silesia, where of course there was a partition by plebiscite at the same time. That's the comparison he likes best for the boundary dispute. When he looks at unification, national unification, the comparison he likes best there, interestingly, is South Africa, because there you see the Dutch, as he puts it, and the British coming together. And he mentions, in a sort of rather offhand paragraph, one of the reasons that they have to come together is it's very hard to maintain civilization, white civilization, given the non-white populations in South Africa who have to be educated and made ready for civility. So that's the sort of complicating factor that I'd like to add to discussions of imperialism. On self-determination, a really key concept at this time, which of course works its way into United Nations documents and eventually via provisional Sinn Fein into the Downing Street Declaration and the Good Friday Agreement at the end of the 20th century. The trouble with self-determination is there's never any agreement on who constitutes the self. You can determine to have your own government, but who determines who forms the people in the first place? So political scientists and historians and international lawyers tend to be quite wary of that concept.
That's a lot to think about there. I'm conscious that we are kind of running out of time a wee bit. So can I talk a little bit, or Anne, more to the point, can you talk a little bit about the experience of the Civil War for ordinary people? And we talked a little bit earlier, we heard a little bit earlier in earlier sessions about the war weariness that kind of had crept in. So what was the experience of Civil War for just ordinary people?
To some extent, it really depended where you were in the country. I mean, obviously, it's much more intense in Dublin those early weeks, and then obviously it moves down into the sort of southern corner. I mean, I think in one level, it's affecting people directly in things like the robbery of banks, post offices, things like that. You get in the things like, you know, everybody being to some degree affected by censorship and what they can't read in the newspapers or how things are being described to them. Things like the, you know, the role of the Catholic Church, the pressure being put maybe on people in congregations to adhere to certain lines. But that said, I think we sometimes assume the Catholic Church is unified on its opinion on the treaty. It quite clearly isn't. If you look at Patrick Murray's work on it, I mean, I think to some extent what I found really striking are those documents that are being assembled in the later months of the Civil War, where Kevin O'Higgins is getting information up from a whole variety of different, getting police reports, bringing them all together and looking at the state of law and order in the country and the degree to which people were taking advantage of the Civil War conditions, effectively to kind of take things, and particularly to take land. And in a couple of cases, people very explicitly saying, this farm, I lost this farm in 1880, now we're free, I'm taking it back. And, you know, all the, if you like, all that goes with that. And there's one really striking report that O'Higgins sends on to Cosgrave and tells him in a very, you could argue, a very sort of patronizing way, read this report all in one sitting, as if the man didn't know how to read a document. But what it does suggest is that they find, I think it's, I can't remember if it's in, I think it's Mayo, they find a doctor in a stolen car. And there's this sort of sense in which even respectable people, as the report says, are not adhering to the law of the land. And in a way, it underlines that urgency about how do we get this place under control again, and maybe over exaggerates the degree to which, from their view, the place needs to get under control again, and maybe leaves that legacy of maybe the fear of violence or the fear of disorder for longer than it needed to be within the cabinet. I don't know, Ciara might have different ideas on that.
Yeah, well, Ciara, I was just going to ask you that actually, because violence on a lower level, obviously, but it does continue into the 20s, even into the 30s, and you can look at the blue shirt thing, and violence is continuing mid-30s.
Yeah, the threat of violence continuously hangs in the air for the 20s and into the 30s, as you say, David. I mean, aside from, well, there's these big moments where obviously you have the assassination of Sean Hales and the reprisals then, which are clearly outside the rule of law. You have the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins in 1927, which is seen as kind of the last victim of the Civil War. But even at a kind of a lower level, when you've got the change of power happening in 1932, there's the rumours of TDs coming into Leinster House with guns in their pockets in case there is going to be any resistance to the change of power. And then, as you mentioned, the blue shirts are perceived to be a threat to democracy. And the IRA, of course, hasn't gone away in the 1930s either. So there's always this sort of tension there that violence could potentially spill over again outside of those big assassinations that I already mentioned. So Anne's right, the environment or the atmosphere that's created in the Civil War heightens this fear of continued violence. And of course, the amendment to the Constitution instituted by the Cumann na Gael government, which is temporarily suspended by Fianna Fáil, which is am I right in saying Article 2A, which gives them the powers to deal with the threat of the IRA and later the threat of the blue shirts as well. That threat of violence is always there, kind of just below the surface.
Ian, I want to return to the North, because we've talked a bit, and we've heard in previous sessions a bit about the reaction of Unionists to the treaty settlement, and Craig, who was, I think you said earlier on, refused to engage in the treaty negotiations quite astutely from his own point of view, I suppose. What about nationalists in the North? Because the curious thing is a lot of the Northern IRA went pro-treaty.
Well, yeah, so just on Craig very quickly, I mean, Craig, as you're implying, continues his policy of obstructionism, but it's a little bit more interesting than that, because the brazenness of James Craig is just astonishing in these years. It's not just, Ulster says no, it's Ulster says no, and I need another £1 million for my beef specials, please. I mean, Craig goes to London, refuses to cooperate, and at the same time asks for money all the time. On the position of Northern nationalists, in general, I mean, these are the people who lose out in this settlement. And their position is despair, abandonment, anger. It's obscured, of course, for several years by the expectations of the Boundary Commission although those expectations also divide Northern nationalists, because people in Fermanagh and Tyrone, I suppose the leaders, Cahir Healy, are looking forward to being transferred into the Free State. So their moment of complete disillusionment comes with De Valera coming in the early 1930s. Whereas in Belfast, the nationalists in Belfast feel that there's very little that they can do except hope for some, reconciliation between what we would now call the two traditions in the north. So, I mean, the usual statement that's quoted for Northern nationalists is Cahir Healy's observation that Southern politicians, when they're out of power, make promises to Northern nationalists. When they're in power, they leave us to paddle our own canoe.
Very good. And a question about Collins, and I mean, there's lots of what ifs about Collins, and people, as you and Will said in your book, people project things onto Collins that weren't necessarily there. But in terms of the North, I mean, his policy oscillated between signing pacts with Craig and planning IRA invasions and all the rest of it. But his removal from the scene in August 1922, did that have a material impact on what the Southern state was prepared to do about partition?
I think it does in many ways. I mean, they're already moving in that direction. There's a sort of committee meets and makes a decision to change policy on Northern Ireland before he dies. So there's already a sort of a shift in that direction. I mean, you can see the frustration of someone like Kevin O'Sheil, and he feels like all they're doing is just creating this sort of empty propaganda that is kind of meaningless and isn't having any effect. I mean, I think is there the first kind of push for the establishment of the Boundary Commission is kind of the end of January 23, but then is it April? I think it's April 23 where there's, if you like, there's the erection of customs posts along the border, which is effectively the Free State putting up a physical marker of a boundary between North and South. Within months of having started this suggestion, if you like, pushing for the Boundary Commission. At the same time, Collins wasn't the only one who was involved in some of those moves towards the north. I mean, Mulcahy and O'Duffy are very much a part of that activity too. So it's very hard to know, because you get a sense that in many of his dealings, and not just in the context of the north, but and maybe it's back to, I'm thinking of something Alvin Jackson said this morning about Lloyd George. There's a degree to which he would have a very particular conversation with one person to get what he wanted, and would then have a very, very different conversation with the next person he met, to some extent to keep all the different plates in the air. And that, I think, very much in the context of Northern Ireland, that was what was going on. It's striking, I think, one Northern IRA leader after his death does make a complaint, I think, to Mulcahy, saying Collins promised us all sorts of things, and what's happening? What's going to happen? So, something needs to work. He promised us, you're letting us down. And I think, O'Duffy is making those kind of big promises too, and equally is sort of also found guilty of letting some of those Northern IRA down.
Of course, the 1938 Anglo-Irish economic agreement was where Northern nationalists had their hopes raised by De Valera, only to have them dashed, and without any great sorrow on his part, he left them, as you said, Ian, to paddle their own canoe. Ciara, could I ask you a question? It was raised by Liam, I think, in the last session. He was talking about the importance of for democratic legitimacy and all the rest of it, for having an opposition in a parliament. And you had a situation in the Free State Dáil for the first 5-ish years where the only opposition was the Labour Party and Independence of Farmers and so on. There wasn't a sort of a very strong opposition to Commonwealth inside the Dáil. What effect did that have, do you think, in terms of, in political terms?
It does raise questions about the extent to which democracy was exercised effectively. But I think if we look at the Free State in the context of what was happening in Central and Eastern Europe as well at this time, it's an interesting commentary on the way that the government operated. So kind of those new states that were created from the breakup of empires, so many of them started the democracy started to crumble, either because you had military coups or they were invaded and so on. Within the Irish Free State, obviously the situation is different. The government doesn't have a proper opposition in the way that we know it today. And yet it's still going about building up the infrastructure of the state, bringing in, setting up the new guards that will become the Garda Síochána, for example, reorganizing the army to ensure that that mutiny that could have happened in 1924, to stamp that out. So there would have been opportunities in many ways to underpin their power, if you know what I mean, but they're at the same time implementing these different organizations that are essential for the running of democracy, like having an independent police force, like having the army that is loyal to the state rather than to the government, so to speak. That's not to say that some of the legislation that went through wasn't problematic, or that there couldn't have been more attention paid to social issues, for example, if an opposition had been there to lobby more actively for them. But I think, yes, it's a problem to an extent that there isn't a fully effective opposition in place. But at the same time, the government was, I think, committed to creating the infrastructure of a democratic state, and did a lot of what was necessary to ensure that when it came to the transfer of power, for example, in 1932, that democracy was actually embedded, so that could happen quite smoothly.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question from the audience. Jerry White, considering Collins's decision to step down as chairman of the provisional government in July 1922 and take up the position of commander-in-chief of the National Army, while at the same time continuing to influence government decisions, would it be correct to describe him as possibly a benign military dictator? Anne, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think John Regan has made the argument that, Collins was shown sort of dictatorial tendencies. I mean, Joe Lee, on the other hand, would argue for someone in that position with so many different levers of power potentially in his hands. He demonstrated it then in a relatively benign way. I mean, I think what I'm more struck by is that when he goes, he's actually quite quickly replaced. And I think Michael Hayes talks about that within, that after the fall of Parnell, it took decades before things got back to sort of working order. But after the if you like, the death of Collins, within 10 hours, things were back in ship shape. This was someone who could be replaced, and very clearly was being contradicted just before his death. Even just thinking back to that last question or two ago about policy in Northern Ireland, he was being contradicted. He was being reined in. And I think, he is replaced, and partly maybe that's a testimony to he's as much about the processes he sets in place, the organization, that he's as much about working with other people. He can't work without the other cogs in the wheel, if you like. And I think we kind of forget that a little bit too much, because we have elevated him into this figure, partly linked to the fact that he does put the uniform on, and he is so publicly photographed in the uniform very strategically. So no, I'd be slightly more benign towards him, and more, if you like, benign towards the view of just how influential those around him were at the time.
Okay. Now we are out of time, I am told, so I'm going to conclude with a general question. This day has been about the treaty debates. So Ian, maybe I'll start with you. Overall, your overriding impression, what is the significance of this whole period?
I think, to begin with, the British, the significance is it gives them what they want, which is not to have to think about Ireland and the Irish, which had been Lloyd George's overriding ambition all the way through, even though he spent so much time intimately involved in this process. His overriding objective is to get out of it, and the same is pretty much true of Ramsay MacDonald, briefly Prime Minister in 1924. And of course, they don't even have to speak about it, because a convention is established that Northern Ireland matters are not discussed in Westminster. For the South, for the 26 counties, it's an opportunity to develop in its own way. And I think it's worth bearing in mind Jan Smuts's advice to De Valera. You don't want the North in at the beginning, because it will ruin everything. It's going to disrupt everything. So the South gets what it wants too. For Northern nationalists, it's a kind of counter-revolution. I think the democratization of politics in Ireland in the later 19th century and early 20th century had empowered Northern nationalists to a new extent, because they were part of an all-Ireland movement. And by severing them from the influence of Southern nationalists, it actually reverses that process. They become, there's greater inequality in the 6 counties, increasing inequality in the 6 counties from the 1920s to the 1960s.
Okay, Ciara, your concluding thoughts?
I'm going to take a longer view and say that the treaty debates and the treaty itself provided the political language that has recurred in the decades since. So even if you look to the 1960s, when you have the passing of the revolutionary generation out of political life and policymakers start to look more forward and think about EEC membership, the treaty is still always part of the lexicon of what politicians talk about when it comes to election time. And even if you look at the last general election, to sort of stave off the progression that's being made by Sinn Fein, you have Leo Varadkar, the leader of the Fine Gael party, talking about how his party were the founders of the state, the ones who had built and defended democracy and so on. So, you know, many decades later, the treaty is still providing useful language and touch points for political parties to stake their claim to different parts of the political legacy.
Okay, final word to you, Anne.
God, I don't know, I think in one way you get the kind of De Valera and Fianna Fáil of the 30s that you might not necessarily have got. You got De Valera as Minister for External Affairs, I think, because of the treaty. He's never going to leave that kind of negotiation to anybody else again. I think one might be more problematically, we get the history of 20th century Ireland may be driven by this idea that this is the chief and most important divide in Irish life and Irish politics, and an underplaying of the degree to which there are bread and butter divides between these 2 parties that, yes, come out of the treaty divide. And just that underplaying of other issues, the underplaying of the economic, the social, for far too long, because we've been obsessed with which side you're on. And the treaty by its nature draws us back into the taking a side. That's it.
Okay, lovely. Anne Dolan, Ciara Meehan, Ian McBride, thank you so much for a really stimulating and interesting discussion. We have gone over time, for which I apologise, as I hand back to Jennifer Redmond.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you to everyone for participating today, especially just there to our last session. It was a wonderful end to a very stimulating morning. I know that takes a lot of expertise and energy to deliver such great quality conversations. So thank you. It's my great pleasure to move on now to the final part, which is some comments from Catherine Connolly, TD, the Lashkran Corla. And just as a technical point, the conference will formally end at the conclusion of her remarks. So it's just left to me to thank you for participating. The chat has been extremely active. There's been tweets, and I do hope you'll revisit this online once it goes live. So thank you to everyone involved, and I'll hand over now to Catherine Connolly, TD.
Díomh a chuirde tá súlagam gur bhain sibh sulta agus tanmheas an cógáil ar maidin, ach chomh leis an spree go bhfuil sibh ag fágáil na chócáide freisin agus sibh spreice tuile macnamh a dhéanamh ar na hábhar a bhuaigh faoi cabbagil ag na hícantóirí. Tá is agam freisin gur cúismhór díomá dúin go léir nach raibh sé ar gcumas a bheith sa leabharlinn le chéile de bharr na pandéma. Sin ráite is cúisbród go éirí leis an dá Ireland na hathruithe cuí a dhéanamh ar ghearr ógra agus an ócáide agrú ar líne chun an chorm 100 bliain tábhachta seo a chomóra. At the outset, it would be remiss of me not to thank all the staff of the Royal Irish Academy and the houses of the Oireachtas service for all of their hard work, commitment and professionalism in organising today's conference. In particular, I would like to thank Mary Canning, the President of the Academy, Professor Jennifer Redmond for astute curation of the panels, and Vanessa Carswell for her organisation of the event. To bring together such a range of speakers and chairpersons while ensuring gender equality is not an easy task at any time, but all the more difficult during a COVID pandemic. In surmounting that challenge, however, you have provided us with an invaluable insight into the period leading up to the treaty debates, the actual debates themselves in both parliaments, and the unfortunate consequences for our country and indeed both countries. In the context of today's topic, it is important to note that the houses of the Oireachtas have enjoyed a fruitful relationship with the Academy over the last 4 years, having previously worked together to mark Vótáil 100 and Dáil 100, two very important occasions in the history of the state and in the decade of centenaries. Today's conference marks the centenary of another foundational event in the formation of the Irish state, namely the debates that ensued in Dáil Éireann following after the signing of the treaty on the 6th of December 2021 and the actual vote on the 7th of January the following year, January 22. Looking back now, it's easier to see how difficult that decision must have been for a fledgling parliament confronted with the military might of the British Empire. Of course, when we reflect on that decision following 13 separate sittings in the Dáil, we cannot do so in isolation from world events, and I understand that this was the context of the first panel discussion this morning. We know that the period leading up to the negotiations was preceded by a truce in the War of Independence earlier in the year in July. Just a few short years before that, the armistice in November 2018 brought an end to the First World War. That was the war to end all wars, and with hindsight and our experience of the Second World War and the continuous wars of the 20th and the 21st century, what a misnomer. A theme for another conference, perhaps, our unacceptable tolerance of unending wars. Amidst the many catastrophic consequences of the First World War, there was what many people saw as a positive, and that was the accelerated decline of powerful empires, which proved a catalyst for the formation of new states, including Ireland. In this regard, the creation of the Irish Free State, as envisaged under the treaty, was seen by many as one further step on the path to nationhood. Many others, of course, saw it as a backward step and a betrayal of the Republic, as declared in the 1916 proclamation. Given the range of reactions and powerful emotions engendered by the treaty, it was inevitable that the contributions to the Dáil debates would be impassioned, at times vitriolic, and at other times very personal. This was the subject of the second panel discussion, as I understand it. And moreover, the intense media pressure on all deputies to publicly take a side could not have been easy for any of the elected members, given the gravity of the decision and knowing well what the consequences would be. Interestingly, while the debates were taking place in the Dáil, a similar discussion was underway in the British Parliament, which lasted for a shorter period of time, 3 public sittings. The key issues there were the loss of sovereignty with the secession of Ireland, the positioning of Northern Ireland within the Irish Free State, albeit with the right to withdraw, and the work of the Boundary Commission, which we know, of course, came to nothing. A striking difference between the two parliaments was that while Lloyd George was deemed in Britain to have solved the Irish question, in Ireland the treaty vote led to a subsequent civil war with all the appalling consequences that ensued and are still felt to this day. I understand these topics were fully examined in the third and final panel session. Before I close, I would like to thank the editor of Debates and her team who produced the official report of the Dáil, the Seanad and more recently Dáil committees. We would be lost without these invaluable volumes. Significantly, Anne Maxwell, the current editor, is a successor to Michael Knightley, who was with the treaty delegation in London in 1921, a member of the volunteers who fought in the GPO and was interned in Francoch. He subsequently went on to become the first editor of Debates, a post he held until 1955. For anyone seeking more information about him, I can refer you to the new treaty pages which have just been launched on the Oireachtas website. Marokil Skar, Sheelam, gur Balach Intach a vís na Jemlina de Chóirí Céad Blin, chun Avretnú agus Stadir a dhéanamh na Hactrí a Harla Céad Blin ó hin, agus chun Tuiscint níos fearr a all orthú. Agus muid ag fécinn siar agus I géirí teacht cóhiiscint a bhfuil bon acadúil agus fírasach mar chaciach léhí an nám córainse a thuí hart, Tá Balach ai a hógalag an freisin hig úmos fri forteach the gach tradiisiún agus túram na Hill seo. In conclusion, thank you once again to the organisers, the guest speakers and the chairpersons who made today's event such a success. The decade of centenaries has been a very useful way to review, study and understand the events of 100 years ago. The deepening of our understanding of those events will hopefully bring us a little more wisdom in surmounting the challenges now facing us on this small island.